Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight, we embark on a peaceful journey through the life of Lady Katherine Grey, a Tudor princess whose royal blood became both her greatest privilege and her ultimate prison during the tumultuous reign of Queen Elizabeth I. We'll softly explore her childhood at Bradgate Park in Leicestershire, from her education alongside her brilliant sister Lady Jane Grey, to her secret marriage that ignited a queen's fury, and finally to her tragic years of imprisonment and separation, all while navigating the dangerous waters of Tudor succession, politics, and the fear that gripped an unmarried queen. Before you drift away into peaceful slumber, please take a moment to like this video. Leave a gentle comment about which Tudor figure you'd like us to explore next, and subscribe to keep these soothing historical tales coming your way. So cozy up, close your eyes, and let these gentle whispers from the 16th century lull you into restful sleep. If you're new here, welcome to the Sleepy Crown family. Catherine, later known as Lady Katherine Grey, Countess of Hertford, entered the world on a warm summer day, the 25th of August in the year 1540, at Bradgate Park, a magnificent country estate nestled in the rolling hills of Leicestershire, England. The ancient stones of Bradgate House would witness her first cries, just as they had sheltered generations of the Grey family before her. This was no ordinary birth, for the infant girl who drew her first breath that August afternoon carried within her veins the blood of kings and queens, a heritage that would shape every moment of her brief and tragic life. The day of Catherine's birth would have been one of celebration at Bradgate Park. Servants would have hurried through the great house, preparing the birthing chamber with fresh linens and bringing hot water and herbs that midwives believed would ease the labor. The birthing chamber itself would have been a warm, enclosed space, its windows covered with heavy tapestries to keep out dangerous draughts that Tudor physicians believed could harm a laboring mother. Candles would have flickered in the semi-darkness, casting dancing shadows on the walls as Lady Frances Brandon, Catherine's mother, labored to bring her second daughter into the world. Frances Brandon Grey was herself a woman of considerable importance and royal blood. Born in 1517, she was the elder daughter of Mary Tudor, Queen of France, and Charles Brandon, the first Duke of Suffolk. Mary Tudor had been the younger and much beloved sister of King Henry VIII, known for her beauty and spirit. In 1514, when Mary was just 18 years old, she had been married to Louis XIV of France as part of a diplomatic alliance, becoming Queen of France. But King Louis was old and sickly, and he died just 3 months after the wedding, leaving Mary a young and beautiful widow. Rather than accept another arranged marriage, Mary had shocked the courts of Europe by secretly marrying Charles Brandon, a handsome English nobleman who had come to France to escort her home. King Henry VIII had been furious at first. His sister had married without his permission, and Brandon was considered beneath her in rank. But Henry loved his sister, and eventually he forgave the couple and allowed them to return to England. The marriage of Mary Tudor and Charles Brandon produced 4 children who survived infancy. Frances was their eldest daughter, born in 1517, and she grew up surrounded by wealth, privilege, and close proximity to royal power. When Frances was 16 years old, she married Henry Grey, Marquis of Dorset, a nobleman whose family had long been prominent in English affairs. Henry Grey traced his own ancestry back to Queen Elizabeth Woodville, who had been queen consort to King Edward IV in the previous century. Through his grandmother Elizabeth Woodville, Henry Grey claimed descent from the royal houses that had ruled England before the Tudors. though this connection was through a female line and carried less weight than direct, male line descent. The marriage between Francis Brandon and Henry Grey united two prominent noble families, both with connections to royalty, and it produced three daughters who would each, in their own way, be touched by the dangerous curse of royal blood. The first daughter, Jane, had been born perhaps 3 years before Catherine, though the exact date of Jane's birth remains uncertain to historians. Jane was a precocious child, brilliant beyond her years, with a fierce intelligence and a passionate commitment to learning that would become legendary. The second daughter, Catherine, born on that August day in 1540, would prove to be different from her scholarly older sister, warmer, more social, more interested in the pleasures of court life than in the rigours of classical study. And the third daughter, Mary, would not be born until 1545, 5 years after Catherine's birth, and she would be marked by physical disabilities that would make her life challenging, but would also, paradoxically, help keep her safe from the dangers that destroyed her older sisters. Bradgate Park, where Catherine was born and where she would spend the early years of her childhood, was one of the great houses of Leicestershire, a county in the heart of England known for its rolling countryside, its ancient forests, and its productive farmlands. The estate had come into the Grey family through a complex series of inheritances and marriages that stretched back over a century. In 1430, Edward Grey, a distant ancestor of Catherine's father, had married Elizabeth Ferrers, a wealthy heiress who brought the manor of Groby to the marriage. Their son, Sir John Grey, had married Elizabeth Woodville, who would later become Queen Consort, to King Edward IV after Sir John's death in battle. The Grey family's connection to Queen Elizabeth Woodville brought them increased prestige and influence, and it was during this period that they began to accumulate the lands and wealth that would make them one of the most important families in Leicestershire. The first Marquess of Dorset, Thomas Grey, who was Queen Elizabeth Woodville's son from her first marriage to Sir John Grey, began the construction of Bradgate House in the late 15th century. The house was revolutionary for its time, one of the first great unfortified manor houses built in England after the end of the Wars of the Roses. For generations, English nobles had built their homes as fortified castles, with thick walls, narrow windows, and defensive towers, because they needed protection from rivals and enemies in the constant warfare that had plagued England. But the Tudor dynasty, established when Henry VII defeated Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485, brought a new era of peace and stability to England. Nobles no longer needed to live in castles, and they could instead build comfortable manor houses designed for gracious living, rather than for defence. Bradgate House was built of brick, a relatively new and expensive building material in England at that time. Brickmaking had largely disappeared from England after the Romans left in the 5th century, and it was only in the late medieval period that brickmaking was revived and became fashionable for high-status buildings. The use of brick at Bradgate House demonstrated the Grey family's wealth and their embrace of new architectural fashions. The house was built around 3 sides of a central courtyard, following a traditional medieval layout, but its design incorporated many innovations that made it more comfortable and pleasant than older castle-style residences. The Great Hall stood at the centre of the house, a magnificent room with a high ceiling, supported by wooden beams, long tables where the household dined, and a raised dais at one end where the family sat. The walls would have been hung with tapestries depicting scenes from classical mythology or biblical stories, providing both decoration and insulation against the cold. A large fireplace would have warmed the hall during the winter months, though the smoke would have made the room somewhat hazy. even with the best chimney design available at the time. The hall served as the heart of household life, where meals were taken, where entertainment was provided, where business was conducted, and where the family received visitors and conducted the ceremonial aspects of noble life. On either side of the great hall stretched two wings containing the more private apartments of the family. The winter parlour provided a smaller, more intimate space where the family could retreat from the formality of the hall, with its own fireplace and comfortable furnishings. The summer parlour, oriented to catch the afternoon sun, offered a pleasant retreat during the warmer months. The chapel allowed the family to observe their religious duties without leaving the house, an increasingly important consideration during the religious upheavals of the 16th century, when one's choice of religious practice could carry dangerous political implications. The upper floors of Bradgate House contained the bedchambers, including the room where Catherine was born. These rooms would have been furnished with large curtain beds to provide warmth and privacy, with chests for storage of clothing and linens, with chairs and tables for comfort and convenience. The windows, larger than in older castle designs, would have been glazed with expensive glass, allowing light to flood into the rooms while keeping out the weather. Tapestries and embroidered wall hangings would have provided both decoration and insulation, important in an era before central heating, when even the grandest houses were cold and drafty during the winter months. The grounds surrounding Bradgate House were as impressive as the house itself. The estate encompassed several thousand acres of land, including cultivated fields that produced grain and vegetables to feed the household, meadows where cattle and sheep grazed, and extensive deer parks where hundreds of red and fallow deer roamed. Deer hunting was the sport of kings and nobles, and a well-stocked deer park was a mark of status and wealth. The deer provided not only sport, but also meat for the table, venison being considered a delicacy and a food appropriate for aristocratic consumption. The parks were enclosed by fences or walls to keep the deer from escaping and to keep poachers out, and they were carefully managed by keepers who ensured that the herds remained healthy and numerous. Ancient oak trees, some of them hundreds of years old, grew throughout the Bradgate estate. These trees, with their massive trunks and spreading branches, provided timber for construction and fuel, acorns for feeding pigs, and shade for the deer and cattle during hot summer days. The River Lynn flowed through the property, its clear waters tumbling over rocks and through peaceful pools, providing fresh water for the household and for the livestock, as well as offering pleasant walking paths along its banks where the family might stroll on summer evenings. The landscape around Bradgate was marked by outcrops of volcanic rock that pushed up through the soil, creating dramatic and rugged formations that gave the area a wild and romantic character, quite different from the gentle rolling hills of much of the English countryside. These rock formations became natural playgrounds for the Grey children, places where Catherine and her sisters could scramble and climb and imagine themselves princesses in fairy tale castles. At the highest point of the estate rose a hill that commanded views across the Leicestershire countryside, though the folly, tower called Old John that now crowns this hill would not be built until the 18th century, long after Catherine's time. Into this beautiful and privileged world, Katherine Grey was born. As the second daughter, she would not carry the weight of being the eldest child, the heir to the family's dynastic ambitions. That burden fell on Jane's shoulders. Catherine could enjoy a somewhat more relaxed childhood, loved and cared for, but not subjected to quite the same intense pressure and expectations that Jane faced. Yet Catherine was still a girl of royal blood, still a potential piece on the chessboard of Tudor politics, still someone whose marriage and future would be decided by political considerations rather than by her own wishes or feelings. The infant Catherine would have been cared for by a wet nurse, a woman employed by the household to breastfeed the baby, as was customary among aristocratic families at the time. Frances Brandon Grey, Catherine's mother, would not have nursed her own children, as this was considered beneath the dignity of a noblewoman, and would also have been thought to interfere with her ability to conceive additional children quickly. The wet nurse would have been carefully selected, a healthy woman of good character who could provide abundant milk for the growing baby. Catherine would have spent her first months in the nursery, under the care of the wet nurse and a small staff of nursemaids and rockers who attended to the needs of the Grey children. As Catherine grew from infant to toddler to young child, she would have begun to learn the basic skills expected of a girl of her station. She learned to walk and talk, to eat properly at table, to curtsy to her elders, to show proper respect to her parents and to other important people. She began to learn her letters and numbers, probably through games and songs rather than through formal instruction at first. She learned simple prayers and religious lessons, memorizing the Lord's Prayer and the 10 Commandments and hearing Bible stories told by the chaplain who served the household. She learned to sew, starting with simple stitches and gradually progressing to more complex needlework as her small fingers gained strength and coordination. Catherine's childhood would have followed the rhythms of the agricultural year and the church calendar. Christmas was celebrated with great festivities, with special foods and entertainments, with the decoration of the great hall with greenery and the singing of carols. Twelfth Night, the end of the Christmas season, brought a feast and perhaps a play or masque performed by members of the household. Lent was a time of fasting and restraint, when rich foods were avoided and the focus turned to prayer and preparation for Easter. Easter itself was the greatest feast of the Christian year, celebrated with joy and thanksgiving, with special services in the chapel and a magnificent feast to break the Lenten fast. Throughout the spring and summer, there were agricultural celebrations to mark the progress of the growing season. May Day brought flowers and dancing. Harvest time brought thanksgiving for the crops that had been gathered, and autumn brought the fattening of livestock in preparation for the winter slaughter that would provide meat for the cold months ahead. The rhythm of these celebrations, deeply rooted in the agricultural life that sustained everyone from the king to the humblest peasant, would have provided structure and meaning to Catherine's early years. As Catherine grew older, her education became more formal and more demanding. The Grey family, like many noble families of the early Tudor period, embraced the humanist educational ideals that had been spreading across Europe since the Renaissance. These ideals held that education was valuable not just for boys who would need to govern estates and conduct business, but also for girls who could benefit from knowledge of classical languages, literature, history, and moral philosophy. This represented a significant departure from medieval attitudes, which had generally held that education for women should be limited to basic literacy, religious instruction, and domestic skills. The Grey sisters' principal tutor was a man named John Aylmer, who had been appointed as chaplain to the household. Aylmer was a committed Protestant who had studied at Cambridge University, one of England's 2 great universities, and who brought to his teaching a fierce devotion to reformed religion and to classical learning. Aylmer believed that the Grey sisters, as girls of royal blood, who might someday play important roles in the governance of England, should receive an education equal to that of any nobleman's son. He set a demanding curriculum that focused on classical languages, particularly Latin and Greek, which were considered the foundation of all serious learning in the 16th century. Jane Grey took to this education with extraordinary enthusiasm, demonstrating a natural aptitude for languages and classical literature that amazed her tutors. By the time she was 10 or 11 years old, Jane could read and write in Latin and Greek with facility, and she could hold learned conversations with university scholars on points of theology and classical philosophy. She loved her studies with a passion that sometimes bordered on obsession, preferring the company of books to that of other children, finding more pleasure in translating passages from Plato or reading the letters of St. Paul in the original Greek than in the games and amusements that delighted other children her age. Catherine, by contrast, showed less enthusiasm for the rigors of classical education. She dutifully learned her Latin, and by the age of 8, she was studying Greek under the tutelage of Thomas Harding, a scholar who had formerly held the prestigious position of Regius Professor of Hebrew at Oxford University. Harding had been forced to resign his position because of the religious changes that accompanied the death of King Henry VIII and the accession of young King Edward VI. But he found employment as tutor to the Grey sisters, bringing with him impressive credentials and deep learning. Under Harding's instruction, Catherine made progress in her Greek studies, but she never developed the passionate love of classical languages that characterized her brilliant older sister. Instead, Catherine showed more interest in the social and artistic aspects of aristocratic life. She enjoyed music and learned to play the virginals, a keyboard instrument similar to a small harpsichord that was popular in Tudor England. She had a pleasant singing voice and could perform the songs and madrigals that were fashionable at court. She loved to dance and quickly mastered the intricate steps of the courtly dances that were an essential skill for anyone who would move in aristocratic circles. She enjoyed fashion and took pleasure in beautiful clothes and jewelry, understanding instinctively that appearance mattered in the world of the Tudor court, where one's status was communicated through visual display as much as through formal titles and positions. Catherine was also fond of animals, a trait that would stay with her throughout her life. She kept small dogs as pets, the sort of lap dogs that were fashionable among noble ladies, and she lavished affection on these creatures. More unusually, she also kept a pet monkey, probably a small primate imported from Africa or Asia at great expense. Monkeys were exotic pets in Tudor England, rare and expensive, and keeping one demonstrated the Grey family's wealth and their access to luxury goods from around the world. Catherine's monkey would have been a source of entertainment and companionship, though monkeys can be mischievous creatures, and Catherine's pet would later cause some trouble by damaging furnishings during her imprisonment. The contrast between Catherine and Jane was noted by contemporary observers and has been commented on by historians ever since. Jane was intellectual, serious, devoted to her studies and her religion, with an intensity that sometimes seemed to exclude everything else. Catherine was warmer, more social, more interested in people and relationships than in abstract learning. This does not mean that Catherine was unintelligent or uneducated. She received an education that would have been exceptional for a girl of any background, and she was literate, well-read, and accomplished in all the skills expected of a noble woman. But she lacked Jane's extraordinary scholarly gifts, and she had different interests and priorities that made her more suited to the life of a courtier than to the life of a scholar. The third Grey sister, Mary, completed the family's constellation. Mary was born in 1545, 5 years after Catherine's birth, and her arrival brought both joy and sorrow to the Grey household. Mary was born with physical disabilities that marked her as different from her sisters and that would affect her throughout her life. She was extremely small in stature. Contemporary descriptions suggest that she suffered from dwarfism or some similar condition that limited her growth. She also had a hunched back, probably caused by scoliosis or some other spinal deformity. In an age that often treated physical disability with superstition and fear, Mary's appearance must have been a source of distress to her parents, who worried about what future she could have given her physical limitations. Yet despite her disabilities, Mary proved to be resilient and strong-willed. She grew up in the shadow of her two older sisters, the brilliant Jane and the beautiful Catherine. But she developed her own personality and her own strengths. She was intelligent, like both her sisters, though perhaps not blessed with Jane's extraordinary scholarly gifts. She was loyal and loving, forming close bonds with her sisters that would survive even the terrible trials that lay ahead. And she possessed a certain toughness, a determination to survive and to make the best of her situation, that would ultimately allow her to outlive both of her older sisters and to die at the relatively advanced age of 33, having survived religious persecutions, political upheavals, and personal tragedies that destroyed many others of her generation. The relationship among the three Grey sisters during their childhood years was complex. Jane, as the eldest and the most intellectually gifted, occupied a special position, receiving more attention from their parents and tutors and bearing greater expectations for future greatness. Catherine, as the middle child, perhaps enjoyed more freedom to develop her own interests without quite as much pressure. Mary, as the youngest, and as the child with disabilities, may have been somewhat overlooked, or may have been treated with a mixture of pity and protectiveness. Yet despite these differences, the sisters seemed to have cared for each other and to have formed bonds that would endure through the catastrophes that would soon tear their family apart. The Grey sisters' mother, Frances Brandon Grey, has been described by some historians as a harsh and domineering parent, quick to criticize and slow to praise, demanding perfection from her daughters and showing little warmth or affection. This characterization comes primarily from a famous letter written by the scholar Roger Ascham, who visited Bradgate Park in 1550 and had a conversation with Lady Jane Grey. According to Asham's later account, Jane told him that her parents were cruel and demanding, that they constantly found fault with everything she did, and that she could never please them no matter how hard she tried. Jane reportedly said that whether she was speaking or silent, sitting or standing, eating or drinking, playing or working, her parents scrutinized her every action and criticized her if she deviated even slightly from perfect behavior. However, modern historians have suggested that this account, published many years after Jane's execution, may have been embellished or exaggerated to create a more dramatic story. Ascham was writing after Jane had become a tragic martyr figure, the innocent victim of political machinations beyond her control, and he may have shaped his recollections to fit this narrative. Nevertheless, there does seem to be evidence that Frances Grey was an ambitious and demanding mother, who had high expectations for her daughters and who saw them primarily as tools to advance the family's position, rather than as individuals with their own needs and desires. Henry Grey, Catherine's father, seems to have been somewhat less formidable than his wife, though he was no less ambitious for his family's advancement. Henry was a committed Protestant who enthusiastically supported the religious reforms that had been implemented during King Henry VIII's break with Rome, and that continued under young King Edward II. He surrounded himself with Protestant clergy and scholars, and he ensured that his daughters were raised in the Reformed faith with a thoroughness that would have important consequences for their futures. Henry was also an active participant in court life and politics, seeking positions and honours that would increase his influence and wealth. The Grey family's fortunes rose significantly during the reign of young King Edward VI, who became king in January 1547 upon the death of his father, Henry VIII. Edward was only 9 years old when he inherited the throne, and because he was a minor unable to rule in his own right, real power fell into the hands of a regency council. This council was soon dominated by Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, who was the king's uncle and who assumed the title of Lord Protector. Somerset used his position to implement radical Protestant reforms, stripping churches of their traditional decorations and ceremonies, abolishing the Catholic Mass, introducing new English language prayer books, and generally transforming English religion in a Protestant direction. Catherine was 7 years old when King Henry VIII died and young Edward VI became king. She was old enough to understand that important changes were happening, even if she could not fully grasp their implications. She would have seen her parents' excitement at the religious reforms being implemented, would have noticed the changes in church services and practices, would have absorbed the Protestant theology that was now being taught openly and officially. She grew up in a world where the old Catholic practices were being swept away and replaced with new Protestant forms, where priests became ministers, where Latin services became English services, where veneration of saints and religious images was condemned as idolatry, and where the Bible was being translated into English so that ordinary people could read it for themselves. These religious changes were not universally popular. Many English people, particularly in the northern and western parts of the country, remained loyal to the old Catholic faith and resented the changes being forced upon them. There were rebellions against the Protestant reforms, most notably the Prayer Book Rebellion in Cornwall and Devon in 1549, which was brutally suppressed by government forces. The religious divisions created by the Reformation would plague England for generations, leading to persecution, violence, and civil conflict. But in the Grey household, there was no ambivalence about religion. The Greys were Protestants through and through, and they raised their daughters to be the same. In February or March of 1547, just weeks after King Henry VIII's death, an extraordinary scandal began to unfold that would bring the Grey family into close contact with one of the most powerful and most reckless men in England. Thomas Seymour, the younger brother of Lord Protector Somerset, and therefore the uncle of the young King Edward VI, was a handsome, charming, and ambitious man who had long harboured romantic feelings for Catherine Parr, the woman who had been King Henry VIII's sixth and final wife. Catherine Parr was a remarkable woman in her own right. She was intelligent, learned, and deeply religious, with a commitment to Protestant reform that matched that of the Grey family. She had married King Henry VIII in 1543, becoming his sixth wife at a time when Henry was an aging, obese, and ill-tempered invalid, suffering from painful ulcers on his legs and a variety of other ailments. Catherine had nursed Henry through his final illness with patience and devotion, and she had also played an important role in the education of Henry's 3 children, ensuring that Prince Edward and Princess Elizabeth received excellent humanist educations and even managing to maintain civil relations with the difficult Princess Mary, despite their religious differences. When Henry VIII died, Catherine Parr was only about 35 years old, still young and vital, and she found herself in the position of Queen Dowager, a widow of the late king. She was wealthy. Henry had provided for her generously in his will, and she had considerable influence at court, but she was also free for the first time in her life to make her own choices about her future. Catherine had been married 3 times before becoming queen, each marriage having been arranged for her by family members seeking advantageous alliances, and she had never had the opportunity to marry for love. Now, as a wealthy widow with no obligation to accept another arranged marriage, Catherine decided to follow her heart. Thomas Seymour had been one of Catherine's admirers before her marriage to Henry VIII, and there is evidence that Catherine had returned his interest. But when King Henry had decided he wanted to marry Catherine, there was no possibility of her choosing Thomas Seymour instead. One did not refuse a proposal from the King of England. Catherine had done her duty and married Henry. But now that Henry was dead, she was free to pursue the relationship with Thomas Seymour that had been interrupted years earlier. With almost indecent haste, the king had been dead for less than 3 months. Catherine Parr and Thomas Seymour married secretly, probably in late April or early May of 1547. The marriage shocked the court when it was revealed. Not only had Catherine remarried with extraordinary speed, but she had married without seeking permission from the king or from his protector. And she had chosen to marry a man who, while noble and related to the king, was hardly of the same exalted status as a queen dowager might have been expected to marry. Thomas Seymour's brother, the Lord Protector Somerset, was embarrassed and angry, seeing Thomas's hasty marriage to Catherine as an example of his younger brother's characteristic recklessness and his constant scheming to increase his own power and influence. Thomas and Catherine Seymour established their household at Sudeley Castle in Gloucestershire, a beautiful property that Thomas had acquired through his various offices and that provided a suitably grand setting for their life together. Catherine seems to have been genuinely happy in her marriage to Thomas, writing letters that expressed her affection for him and her joy at finally being able to marry the man she had loved. Thomas, for his part, was happy to have married a wealthy and influential woman who brought him closer to the centre of power and who might help him in his constant rivalry with his older brother. It was into this household that Lady Jane Grey came in the summer of 1547. Henry Grey, Catherine's father, had been negotiating with Thomas Seymour about Jane's future, and they reached an agreement whereby Jane's wardship would be sold to Seymour for £2,000, a substantial sum of money. In exchange, Seymour would take responsibility for Jane's upbringing and education, and he hinted strongly that he might be able to arrange a marriage between Jane and the young King Edward VI. Such a marriage would be spectacularly advantageous for the Grey family, making Jane the Queen of England and elevating her family to the highest levels of power and influence. Whether Thomas Seymour genuinely believed he could arrange such a marriage, or whether he was simply making promises he had no ability to keep, is unclear. As the king's uncle, he did have some influence over Edward, but the real power lay with his brother Somerset, the Lord Protector, and Somerset would never have agreed to a marriage between the king and Jane Grey. Nevertheless, Henry Grey was willing to gamble on Seymour's promises, and he agreed to send his eldest daughter to live at Sudeley Castle. For Jane, the move to Catherine Parr's household was probably welcome. At Sudeley, she found a warm and loving environment quite different from the stern discipline of her parents' house. Catherine Parr was interested in education and encouraged Jane's scholarly pursuits, providing her with access to learned tutors and engaging her in theological discussions. Catherine was also kind and affectionate, treating Jane with a gentleness that the girl had rarely experienced from her own mother. Jane seems to have blossomed at Sudeley, forming a close bond with Catherine that would end only with the Queen Dowager's untimely death. With Jane away at Sudeley Castle, Catherine became the eldest daughter at home at Bradgate Park. This change in her position would have brought new responsibilities and new attention from her parents. As the eldest daughter present in the household, Catherine would have been expected to help with the management of the house, to serve as a companion to her mother, and to represent the family at local social occasions. It was also during this period that Catherine would have completed her formal education, preparing her for the life that lay ahead as a marriageable young woman of royal blood. The peaceful life at Sudeley Castle was shattered in September of 1548, when Catherine Parr died following the birth of a daughter. Catherine had been pregnant when Jane arrived at Sudeley, and she'd given birth on the 30th of August to a baby girl named Mary. The birth seems to have gone well initially, but within a few days, Catherine developed puerperal fever, the often fatal infection that claimed the lives of so many women in the days before modern medicine and antiseptic practices. Catherine's condition deteriorated rapidly, and she died on the 5th of September, just 6 days after giving birth, leaving Thomas Seymour a widower and leaving the infant Mary motherless. Lady Jane Grey, just 11 years old, served as chief mourner at Catherine Parr's funeral, a solemn duty that testified to the close relationship between the Queen Dowager and her young ward. The funeral was held at Sudeley Castle's chapel, with full honours appropriate for a queen, and Catherine was laid to rest in a tomb that would be rediscovered centuries later when the castle was restored. After the funeral, there was the question of what should happen to Jane. Thomas Seymour wanted her to remain in his household, arguing that their previous arrangement still stood and that he would continue to work toward a marriage between Jane and the king. But Frances Grey, Jane's mother, was now concerned about the propriety of her daughter remaining in the household of a widower, and she insisted that Jane return to Bradgate Park. There were darker concerns as well. Rumours had begun to circulate about Thomas Seymour's behaviour toward Princess Elizabeth, who had also been living in Catherine Parr's household earlier that year. According to these rumours, Seymour had engaged in inappropriate behaviour with the 14-year-old princess, entering her bedchamber in the mornings while she was still in bed, tickling her and engaging in romping that was far too familiar for a grown man and a young girl who was not his daughter. Catherine Parr had eventually sent Elizabeth away from the household, apparently having become concerned about Seymour's behaviour, and Elizabeth had been living with Sir Anthony Denny and his wife at the time of Catherine's death. These rumours would eventually contribute to Seymour's downfall, though at the time they remained just whispers and innuendo rather than formal charges. Jane Grey returned to Bradgate Park in the autumn of 1548. Having been away for more than a year, she brought with her happy memories of her time with Catherine Parr, and perhaps some grief at the loss of the woman who had treated her so kindly. Back at Bradgate, Jane resumed her studies with John Aylmer and continued her remarkable progress in classical languages and theology. Catherine, now 8 years old, would have been pleased to have her older sister home, though Jane's return also meant that Catherine was no longer the eldest daughter in the household and had to resume her position as the middle child. The events of the next few months would prove catastrophic for Thomas Seymour and would serve as an early lesson to the Grey family about the dangers of political ambition. Thomas Seymour, frustrated by his secondary position compared to his brother the Lord Protector, began to plot to increase his own power. He attempted to gain control of the young King Edward VI's person, believing that if he could separate the king from his brother's influence, he could become the dominant force in the government. He made several attempts to enter the king's chambers at night, possibly intending to kidnap Edward or to assassinate the gentleman who guarded him. He also attempted to marry Princess Elizabeth, believing that such a marriage would give him a strong claim to power and perhaps even to the throne itself if Edward died without heirs. These schemes were discovered, and in January of 1549, Thomas Seymour was arrested and charged with treason. The charges against him were serious and well documented. He had attempted to gain control of the king's person. He had plotted to marry Princess Elizabeth without permission. He had embezzled money from the Bristol Mint, and he had raised private forces that might be used against the government. Thomas was imprisoned in the Tower of London, and despite his family connections, his brother was the Lord Protector. His nephew was the king. His late wife had been queen. He was convicted of treason by an Act of Attainder passed by Parliament. On the 20th of March, 1549, Thomas Seymour, Baron Seymour of Sudeley, was executed on Tower Hill. He was about 40 years old, and he died without making any confession or showing any repentance for his actions. His execution sent shockwaves through the English court and served as a harsh reminder that even the most powerful families were not immune from destruction if they threatened the stability of the realm. For the Grey family, Seymour's fall was a disaster. They had paid £2,000 for Jane's wardship, and they had nothing to show for it except broken promises and the taint of association with a convicted traitor. Thomas Seymour's execution also left his family in a difficult position. His widow, Catherine Parr, was already dead, having died just 6 months earlier. His infant daughter, Mary Seymour, became an orphan, and her fate remains unclear. She probably died in infancy, as there are no further records of her after 1549. His mother, Marjorie Wentworth, was still alive and was devastated by the loss of her son, and his children from his brother's family, including a boy named Edward Seymour, who would one day become Earl of Hertford, grew up with the knowledge that their uncle had been executed for treason and that the Seymour family name had been stained with disgrace. The wheel of fortune would soon turn again, and this time it would be Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, the Lord Protector himself, who would fall from power. Somerset had made many enemies during his time as Lord Protector through his religious reforms, his social policies that favoured the common people at the expense of the nobility, and his general arrogance and high-handedness in dealing with other members of the government. A rival faction, led by John Dudley, Earl of Warwick, organised a coup against Somerset in October of 1549. Somerset was arrested and imprisoned in the Tower of London, accused of various crimes including mismanagement of the government and plotting against other council members. Initially, it seemed that Somerset might survive this political reverse. He was released from the Tower in early 1550 and made a reconciliation with his enemies, agreeing to share power with John Dudley and other council members. For more than a year, Somerset remained at liberty and retained some influence in the government, but his enemies had not forgiven him, and they continued to plot his final destruction. In October of 1551, Somerset was arrested again, this time charged with plotting to overthrow the government and murder members of the Privy Council, including John Dudley, who had by now risen to become Duke of Northumberland. Somerset was tried for treason in December of 1551. The evidence against him was thin, and many contemporaries believed that the charges were fabricated by his enemies, who wanted to eliminate him permanently. Nevertheless, Somerset was convicted, not of treason, but of the lesser charge of felony, which still carried the death penalty. On the 22nd of January, 1552, Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, former Lord Protector of England, was beheaded on Tower Hill in front of a large crowd. Some observers reported that the crowd mourned for Somerset, who had been popular with common people for his efforts to protect them from exploitation by greedy landlords. His execution marked the final triumph of John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, who now became the undisputed master of the English government. The fall of the Seymour brothers, first Thomas executed in 1549, then Edward executed in 1552, left their family shattered. Anne Seymour, Duchess of Somerset and widow of the Lord Protector, was a proud and formidable woman who never accepted that her husband had been guilty of the crimes for which he was executed. She was left with several children to raise alone, including that Edward Seymour, who would eventually become Earl of Hertford, and who would one day play such a crucial role in Catherine Grey's life. The Seymour children grew up in the shadow of their fathers' and uncles' executions, their family name tainted by treason, their fortunes diminished, and their futures uncertain. For Catherine Grey, living at Bradgate Park and now approaching her 12th birthday, these dramatic events at court would have seemed distant and perhaps not immediately relevant to her own life. She continued her education, practiced her music and dancing, played with her pets, and prepared herself for whatever future her parents would arrange for her. But the fall of the Seymour family would have important consequences for Catherine's own future, for it was at Anne Seymour's household that Catherine would later be placed, and it was through Anne's daughter Jane that Catherine would meet the man she would love and marry, setting in motion the tragedy that would define her life. By the year 1552, when Catherine was approaching her 12th birthday, the political situation in England had stabilised, somewhat under the firm control of John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland. Northumberland had emerged victorious from the power struggles that had claimed both of the Seymour brothers, and he now governed England in the name of the young King Edward VI, who was approaching his 15th birthday, but still not quite old enough to rule independently. Northumberland proved to be an even more radical Protestant reformer than Somerset had been, and he pushed forward with changes that stripped away the last vestiges of traditional Catholic practice from English churches and religious life. Edward VI, despite his youth, was deeply involved in these religious reforms. The young king had been raised as a Protestant from infancy, and he had developed strong religious convictions that matched those of his most ardent Protestant advisors. Edward was intelligent, serious-minded, and deeply pious, spending hours in prayer and study of Scripture. He kept a detailed journal in which he recorded political events and his own thoughts about governance and religion. He was also sickly, however, suffering from frequent illnesses that worried his doctors and advisors. By 1552, Edward's health was beginning to show signs of serious deterioration, though no one yet suspected that he had only about a year left to live. The question of the succession was becoming increasingly urgent as Edward's health declined. Under the terms of King Henry VIII's will, and the Act of Succession that Parliament had passed to give legal force to that will, the succession after Edward was clear. First would come Mary, Henry's eldest daughter, even though she had been declared illegitimate. Then would come Elizabeth, Henry's second daughter, who had also been declared illegitimate, and only if both Mary and Elizabeth died without legitimate heirs would the crown pass to the descendants of Henry XIII's younger sister, Mary Tudor, Duchess of Suffolk, which meant the Grey family. Henry's will had explicitly excluded the descendants of his elder sister Margaret, Queen of Scotland, from the English succession, even though by normal rules of hereditary succession they would have had the strongest claim. The problem with this succession arrangement, from the Protestant perspective, was that Mary Tudor was a devout Catholic who had remained loyal to the old religion throughout all the changes of her father's and brother's reigns. If Mary became queen, everyone expected that she would attempt to restore Catholicism in England, undoing all the religious reforms that had been implemented since 1533. For Protestant leaders like Northumberland, and for the young King Edward himself, this prospect was intolerable. They had convinced themselves that Protestant Christianity represented the true faith, and that Catholicism was a corrupt perversion of Christian teaching. To allow England to return to popish superstition, as they called Catholic practice, would be to betray God and to endanger the souls of all English people. Princess Elizabeth presented a less problematic succession prospect, as she had been raised Protestant and could be expected to maintain the Reformed religion if she became queen. However, Elizabeth's own legitimacy was questionable. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, had been executed for adultery and treason, and Parliament had declared Elizabeth a bastard. Moreover, Elizabeth was a woman, and there was considerable uncertainty about whether a woman could effectively rule England in her own right. The brief reign of Empress Matilda in the 12th century, which had led to civil war, was not an encouraging precedent, and many people believed that a woman ruler would be weak, easily manipulated, and unable to command the respect necessary for effective governance. These concerns about the succession led Edward VI and his chief minister, the Duke of Northumberland, to begin considering alternatives to the succession established by Henry VIII's will. If Mary could not be allowed to succeed because of her Catholicism, and if Elizabeth was also problematic because of questions about her legitimacy and the challenges of female rule, then perhaps the succession should skip over both of them and go directly to the next line. The descendants of Mary Tudor, Duchess of Suffolk. This meant the Grey family, and more specifically, it meant Lady Jane Grey, who was the eldest surviving child of Francis Brandon Grey. But there was a complication even here. Francis Brandon Grey was still alive and, according to strict rules of hereditary succession, should come before her daughter Jane in the line of succession. If the crown was to pass over Mary and Elizabeth and go to the Suffolk line, then logically it should go to Frances herself. However, Frances was now about 35 years old and, while not old by modern standards, was past the age when women typically bore many more children in the 16th century. Moreover, Frances had married Henry Grey, and if she became queen, Henry would expect to be recognized as king consort, which would give him power and influence that Northumberland did not want to grant. Jane Grey, by contrast, was young, intelligent, deeply Protestant, and still unmarried, which meant that Northumberland could control whom she married and thereby control access to power in the next reign. Sometime in the spring or early summer of 1552, negotiations began for betrothals that would bind the Grey family even more closely to the circle of power around young King Edward. Catherine Grey, now 11 years old, and approaching the age of 12, which was the minimum legal age for marriage, was betrothed to Henry Herbert, the son and heir of William Herbert, Earl of Pembroke. The Earl of Pembroke was one of the most powerful noblemen in England, with vast estates in Wales and the west of England, and he was a key supporter of Northumberland's government. The betrothal represented an excellent match for Catherine and demonstrated the Grey family's rising importance in the political constellation of Edward VI's reign. The betrothal ceremony would have been a formal occasion, with contracts signed and witnessed, with gifts exchanged between the families, and with prayers and blessings pronounced over the young couple. Catherine and Henry Herbert probably met for the first time at this betrothal, though they may have seen each other at court previously. Henry was about 3 years older than Catherine, born around 1537 or 1538, and he was described as a pleasant young man, though history has preserved few details about his character or appearance. The betrothal bound Catherine and Henry together and began a formal relationship that would eventually lead to marriage, though the actual wedding would not take place for almost a year. During the months of their betrothal, Catherine and Henry would have had opportunities to spend time together under the watchful eyes of their elders, getting to know each other in preparation for their future married life. They probably danced together at court festivities, conversed at formal dinners, and perhaps exchanged letters when they were separated. Catherine was still very young, just 11 or 12 years old, but she was old enough to understand that this betrothal represented her future, that Henry Herbert would be her husband, and that her life would be bound to his and to the Herbert family. Catherine's older sister Jane was also betrothed during this period, though the arrangements for Jane's betrothal were kept more secret because of their political sensitivity. The Duke of Northumberland had decided that Jane should marry his own son, Lord Guildford Dudley, thereby creating a direct connection between the Suffolk claim to the throne and the Dudley family. Guildford was Northumberland's fourth son, but his three older brothers were already married, making Guildford available as a husband for Jane. The marriage would give Northumberland enormous influence over the succession if Jane were to become queen, as he would be the father-in-law of the monarch, a position almost as powerful as being king himself. The preparations for these marriages were taking place against an increasingly somber backdrop. King Edward VI's health was failing rapidly. By the winter of 1552 and the spring of 1553, it was becoming clear that the young king was seriously ill with what was probably tuberculosis, the same disease that had killed his uncle Thomas Seymour's daughter, and that would eventually kill Katherine Grey herself. Edward suffered from a persistent cough that brought up blood and pus. He had a high fever that came and went, and he was growing increasingly weak and emaciated. His doctors tried various treatments, bleeding, purging, herbal remedies, but nothing helped, and Edward's condition continued to deteriorate. As Edward weakened, the succession question became urgent. The young king, encouraged by Northumberland and by his own Protestant convictions, decided to take matters into his own hands and change the succession established by his father's will. Edward composed a document known as his Devise for the Succession, in which he attempted to alter the line of succession to ensure that the throne would pass to a Protestant heir. Edward's original devise named the Lady Frances's heirs male as his successors, meaning male children that Frances Brandon Grey might bear in the future. But as Edward's health worsened, and it became clear that he would not live long enough for Frances to bear any sons, Edward changed his devise to name the Lady Jane and her heirs male as his successors, effectively making Jane Grey his heir and passing over both Mary and Elizabeth. This change to the succession was highly controversial and probably illegal. King Henry VI's will had been given the force of law by an Act of Parliament, and Edward VI did not have the authority to overturn an Act of Parliament simply by writing his own will. Moreover, Edward was a minor. He would not turn 16 until October of 1553, and questions could be raised about whether a minor king had the legal capacity to make such momentous decisions. Nevertheless, Edward was determined, and Northumberland ensured that the Privy Council and the judges endorsed Edward's devise, even though some of them had serious reservations about its legality. To strengthen Jane Grey's position as heir to the throne, it was essential that she be married to someone suitable, and it was equally important that Katherine Grey, as the second in line under Edward's devise, also be married. In May of 1553, Northumberland organised a spectacular triple wedding that would take place at Durham House, one of the great noble residences on the Strand in London. Durham House was a magnificent property with extensive gardens running down to the River Thames, and it provided a suitably grand setting for what Northumberland intended to be a dynastic celebration that would demonstrate the unity and strength of the Protestant faction. The weeks leading up to the wedding would have been busy and exciting times for Catherine. She was preparing to marry Henry Herbert, to leave her childhood behind and become a married woman, to take her place in the adult world of politics and courtly intrigue. There would have been fittings for her wedding dress, which would have been made of rich fabrics, perhaps silk or velvet, and decorated with embroidery and jewels appropriate to her status. There would have been discussions about her dowry, the money and property that the Grey family would provide to support her in her married life. There would have been preparations for the journey to London, for the Grey family would travel from Bradgate Park to attend the wedding at Durham House. The Wedding day itself, the 25th of May, 1553, was a spectacular occasion. 3 couples were married in a ceremony that combined religious solemnity with political calculation and dynastic ambition. Lady Jane Grey, the bride of greatest importance, married Lord Guildford Dudley in a ceremony that was witnessed by much of the English court. Jane was probably wearing a gown made of gold and silver cloth, with a headdress decorated with pearls and precious stones, presenting an image of regal magnificence even though she was not yet queen. Guildford Dudley, described by some sources as handsome, but by others as arrogant and spoiled, stood beside Jane as they exchanged their vows and became man and wife. At the same time, Lady Katherine Grey married Henry Herbert in a parallel ceremony that formalized the betrothal that had been agreed upon the previous year. Catherine, not quite 13 years old, would have been dressed in clothing almost as magnificent as her sisters, for this was an occasion to display the wealth and status of both the Grey and Herbert families. Her red gold Tudor hair would have been arranged in the elaborate styles fashionable at court, perhaps with jewels or flowers woven through it. She would have stood beside Henry Herbert, her new husband, a boy of 15 or 16, and spoken the vows that bound them together in matrimony. I, Catherine, take thee, Henry, to be my wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to be bonny and buxom in bed and at board, till death us do part, and thereto I plight thee my troth. The third couple married that day consisted of Catherine Dudley, Northumberland's daughter, who married Henry Hastings, the son and heir of the Earl of Huntingdon. Hastings brought his own royal connections to the alliance, for he was descended from the Plantagenet kings through his great-grandmother Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury. The triple wedding represented a complex web of alliances designed to strengthen the Protestant party and to create a network of family connections that would support Jane Grey's succession to the throne when King Edward died. After the wedding ceremony, there was feasting and celebration. Long tables would have been set up in the Great Hall of Durham House, laden with elaborate dishes that demonstrated the wealth and generosity of the hosts. There would have been multiple courses, perhaps starting with salads and fruit, then progressing through roasted meats including beef, pork, lamb, venison, and various fowl, then fish dishes to satisfy religious requirements, then pastries and sweetmeats and elaborate sugar sculptures called subtleties that were works of art as much as food. Wine would have flowed freely, and musicians would have played while the guests ate and celebrated. After the feast came entertainment. There would have been dancing, with the newly married couples leading the company in the intricate steps of courtly dances like the pavane and the galliard. Catherine, who loved dancing and had been well trained in the art, would have enjoyed this part of the celebration, even if she felt nervous about her new status as a married woman. There might have been a masque, a form of elaborate court entertainment that combined music, dance, poetry, and spectacle, with courtiers dressing in fantastic costumes to act out allegorical scenes. There would have been jousting, with armoured knights competing in mock combat to honour the brides and demonstrate their prowess at arms. Through all of this celebration, one important person was notably absent: King Edward VI himself. The young king was too ill to attend the wedding of his cousin Jane Grey and her sisters. Edward remained at Greenwich Palace, confined to his bed, coughing and fevered, his strength failing day by day. He sent rich gifts to the 3 couples, jewels and plate and other treasures from the royal collections. But his inability to attend the wedding was a stark reminder that time was running out. Edward was dying, and when he died, the succession plan that he and Northumberland had crafted would be put to the test. After the wedding, Catherine went to live at Baynard's Castle, the London residence of the Herbert family. Baynard's Castle was located on the north bank of the Thames, just west of St. Paul's Cathedral, in an area that was home to many of London's most powerful noble families. The castle, which was actually more of a fortified manor house than a true castle by this point, was a comfortable and prestigious residence, and Catherine would have had her own apartments there where she lived with her new husband and with the rest of the Herbert household. Life at Baynard's Castle would have been quite different from life at Bradgate Park. Instead of the rural setting of Leicestershire, with its forests and deer parks and quiet countryside, Catherine was now living in the heart of London, the largest city in England and one of the great cities of Europe. London in 1553 was a crowded, noisy, bustling metropolis of perhaps 80,000 people, with narrow streets lined with timber-framed buildings, with markets where merchants sold goods from around the world, with churches and monasteries and great halls, with the massive bulk of St. Paul's Cathedral dominating the skyline. The Thames was crowded with boats and ships, carrying goods and passengers up and down the river, and the river itself served as the city's main highway, faster and more convenient than travelling through the congested streets. Catherine and her new husband, Henry Herbert, were both very young. She was 12, he was 15, and their marriage was not expected to be consummated immediately. The age of consent for marriage was 12 for girls and 14 for boys, but actual consummation was generally delayed until the bride was at least 14, to protect her health and ensure that pregnancy would not endanger her life. So Catherine and Henry probably lived together as companions and friends, rather than as fully married partners, getting to know each other and preparing for the time when their marriage would become complete in all respects. Contemporary sources suggest that Catherine and Henry grew fond of each other during the brief time they spent together. They were close in age. They shared similar backgrounds as children of powerful noble families, and they were both caught up in the same political currents that were sweeping through England. Henry had been ill earlier in the year, but he seems to have recovered his health by the time of the wedding. Catherine, for her part, was probably pleased to have a husband who was young and apparently kind, rather than being forced to marry an older man, chosen purely for political advantage. If circumstances had been different, if the succession crisis had not intervened, Catherine and Henry might have had a long and happy marriage together. But circumstances were not different, and the succession crisis was about to explode in a way that would change Catherine's life forever. Through June and into early July of 1553, King Edward VI continued to decline. His legs swelled with fluid, his cough grew worse, and he could no longer rise from his bed. His doctors tried increasingly desperate remedies, but nothing helped. Edward knew he was dying, and he made final preparations, signing his device for the succession and urging his councillors to support Jane Grey's claim to the throne. On the evening of the 6th of July, 1553, King Edward II died at Greenwich Palace. He was 15 years old, and he had reigned for 6 years and just over 5 months. For several days after Edward's death, Northumberland tried to keep the news secret, while he made preparations to proclaim Jane Grey as Queen and to prevent Princess Mary from claiming the throne. But news of the king's death could not be suppressed for long, and Mary, who had been warned that her brother was dying, had already fled to her estates in East Anglia, where she began gathering supporters. On the 10th of July, 3 days after Edward's actual death was first publicly announced, the Privy Council proclaimed Jane Grey as Queen of England, and Jane was taken from Sion House, where she had been staying, to the Tower of London, the traditional residence of monarchs before their coronation. Catherine, as the sister of the new queen and as wife of one of the most powerful nobleman's sons, participated in the ceremonies that attended Jane's proclamation. She witnessed her sister being proclaimed queen, saw Jane being rowed up the Thames in the royal barge to take possession of the Tower, watched as Jane took her seat on the throne, and received the homage of the nobles and councillors who came to pay their respects. It must have been an extraordinary and surreal experience for Catherine. Her scholarly older sister, the girl who had always preferred books to politics, was now Queen of England, and Catherine herself was now second in line to the throne after Jane and any children Jane might have. But even as these ceremonies were taking place in London, ominous news was arriving from East Anglia. Princess Mary had not accepted Jane's proclamation as queen, and she was gathering an army to assert her own claim to the throne. Mary had issued a proclamation declaring herself the rightful queen by the laws of God and man, and she called upon all loyal subjects to support her cause. Surprisingly, people responded to Mary's call in large numbers. Nobles, gentlemen, common soldiers, and ordinary farmers flocked to Mary's standard, not necessarily because they supported her Catholicism, but because they recognized that she was King Henry VIII's legitimate daughter and that she had the rightful claim to the throne under the laws of England. The Duke of Northumberland led an army out of London to confront Mary and to crush her rebellion before it could grow. But as he marched northeast toward East Anglia, his army began to melt away as soldiers deserted and refused to fight for Jane Grey's cause. Meanwhile, in London, the Privy Council was beginning to have second thoughts about the wisdom of supporting Jane's claim. The councillors had gone along with Edward II's device while the king was alive, but now that Edward was dead and the country was rallying to Mary, they began to reconsider their position. The Earl of Pembroke, Catherine's father-in-law, was one of the leaders in this change of opinion. On the 19th of July, barely 9 days after Jane had been proclaimed queen, the Privy Council in London abandoned Jane's cause and declared for Mary Tudor. The nobles, who had seemed to support Jane, now revealed that they had been preparing to betray her all along, or perhaps they simply recognized that Jane's cause was hopeless and decided to save themselves by switching sides before it was too late. William Herbert, Earl of Pembroke, was one of those who led this betrayal, declaring loudly for Queen Mary and helping to organize the proclamation that reversed Jane's accession. For Jane Grey, the reversal of fortune was complete and devastating. She had been queen for 9 days, or perhaps 13 days if one counts from Edward's actual death rather than from her proclamation. And now she found herself a prisoner in the very Tower of London that was supposed to have been her palace. The Duke of Northumberland was arrested as he tried to flee, and he would be tried and executed for treason within weeks. Jane remained in the Tower, her future uncertain, hoping that her youth and her obvious unwillingness to claim the throne might save her from the executioner's axe. For Catherine, Jane's fall meant the sudden and complete reversal of her own fortunes as just days earlier, she had been the sister of the Queen and second in line to the throne. Now she was the sister of a prisoner accused of treason, tainted by association with a failed coup, married into a family that had supported Jane's claim, but was now desperately trying to distance itself from the disaster. The Earl of Pembroke moved quickly to cut all ties with the Grey family, and the most obvious way to do that was to dissolve the marriage between his son Henry and the now disgraced Catherine Grey. The annulment of Catherine's marriage to Henry Herbert was handled quickly and quietly, without the sort of lengthy ecclesiastical proceedings that might have been required under other circumstances. The Earl of Pembroke argued that the marriage had never been consummated. Catherine was only 12 and Henry was 15, and they had been married for less than 2 months, so this claim was almost certainly true. Under church law, an unconsummated marriage could be annulled relatively easily, as the marriage was not considered fully complete until the couple had engaged in sexual intercourse. The physical union of the married couple was considered an essential component of marriage, and without it, the marriage could be dissolved as if it had never existed. Catherine and Henry might have protested that they wanted to remain married, that they had grown fond of each other during their brief time together, that they wished to have the opportunity to build a life as husband and wife, but their wishes counted for nothing against the Earl of Pembroke's determination to protect his family. Pembroke had no intention of remaining connected to the Grey family now that the Greys had been revealed as traitors who had supported a pretender to the throne. An annulment would free Henry Herbert from any association with Catherine Grey and would allow the Herbert family to distance themselves completely from the disaster that had engulfed the Greys. The ecclesiastical court that heard the petition for annulment was probably not inclined to look too deeply into the case. The judges understood what Queen Mary's new government wanted. They wanted the tangled web of alliances that Northumberland had created through the triple wedding to be dissolved. They wanted the participants in that wedding to be separated from each other. They wanted the whole plot to place Jane Grey on the throne to be undone as completely as possible. The annulment was granted, probably in late 1553 or early 1554, and Catherine found herself unmarried once again. Her brief time as Lady Herbert erased. Her status returned to Lady Katherine Grey, an unmarried daughter of a disgraced family. The annulment must have been painful for Catherine, representing, as it did, not just the end of her marriage, but the public humiliation of her family and the revelation of how quickly supposed allies would abandon those who fell from power. Catherine had spent less than 2 months as a married woman, living at Baynard's Castle, getting to know her young husband, imagining what their future life together might be like. Now all of that was gone, wiped away as if it had never existed. She was sent back to her mother, no longer welcome in the Herbert household, her status uncertain and her future unclear. The Grey family's situation was precarious in the extreme. Jane remained imprisoned in the Tower, accused of high treason for having claimed the throne that rightfully belonged to Mary. The Duke of Northumberland had been tried, convicted, and executed on the 22nd of August, dying with a false conversion to Catholicism on his lips in a last desperate attempt to save himself that failed completely. Catherine's father, Henry Grey, Duke of Suffolk, had been deeply implicated in the plot to make Jane queen. He had been one of the witnesses to Edward II's device for the succession. He had supported Jane's proclamation, and he had been present at the Tower during Jane's brief reign. By rights, he should have been arrested and tried alongside Northumberland, and he probably expected to share Northumberland's fate on the scaffold. But Queen Mary, to the surprise of many, showed a degree of mercy toward the Grey family that few had expected. Mary had known Francis Brandon Grey slightly from earlier years, and she was aware that Francis had not been directly involved in the plot to put Jane on the throne. Mary also seems to have recognized that Jane herself had been a pawn in Northumberland's schemes, rather than an active conspirator. The young girl had clearly not sought the crown, and had accepted it only under enormous pressure from Northumberland and from her own parents. Moreover, Jane was Mary's cousin, connected to her through their shared descent from King Henry VII, and Mary may have felt some family loyalty despite the political circumstances. Mary decided to spare the lives of both Jane Grey and Henry Grey, Duke of Suffolk, though both remained under various forms of custody and restriction. Jane continued to be held in the Tower of London. though she was given comfortable apartments and was allowed to have servants and even to receive visitors under supervision. She was not treated as a dangerous criminal, but rather as a young woman who had been caught up in events beyond her control and who posed no real threat as long as she remained confined. Henry Grey was initially imprisoned, but was released after a few months, though his movements were restricted and he was required to pay an enormous fine for his part in the succession plot. Frances Brandon Grey, Catherine's mother, emerged from the crisis with her position at court somewhat restored. Mary allowed Frances to return to court and even showed her some favour, perhaps out of respect for Frances's mother, the Dowager Duchess of Suffolk, who had been a friend to Mary's mother, Catherine of Aragon. In earlier and happier times, Catherine and her younger sister Mary also found places at Mary's court, serving as maids of honour to the new queen, a position that allowed them to remain at the centre of court life, while also keeping them under the queen's watchful eye. Serving as a maid of honour to Queen Mary would have been both an honour and a burden for Catherine. On one hand, the position gave her access to the court, opportunities to participate in the ceremonies and festivities that marked royal life, and a chance to associate with other young women from important families. On the other hand, Catherine was serving a queen who had every reason to be suspicious of the Grey family, who followed a religion that Catherine privately rejected, and who represented everything that Catherine's Protestant upbringing had taught her to oppose. It required Catherine to maintain a careful facade of loyalty and obedience while concealing her true religious beliefs and her real feelings about the Catholic restoration that Mary was implementing. For Catherine had been raised as a Protestant from infancy, and that upbringing had shaped her fundamental beliefs about religion and salvation in ways that could not easily be changed. She had been taught that the Catholic Mass was idolatrous, that the veneration of saints was a form of paganism, that the authority of the Pope was a human invention with no basis in Scripture, that salvation came through faith alone rather than through good works and sacraments. These beliefs were deeply held, and Catherine could not simply abandon them because the government had changed, but neither could she express them openly, for to do so in Mary's England would be to court persecution and possibly death. Mary Tudor's reign brought dramatic changes to English religious life as the new queen set about undoing all the Protestant reforms that had been implemented during her father's and brother's reigns. Mary's goal was to restore Catholicism to England, to bring the country back into communion with Rome, to rebuild the monasteries that had been dissolved, to restore the traditional practices of Catholic worship, and to heal what she saw as the spiritual wounds that heresy had inflicted on her realm. To accomplish these goals, Mary needed to suppress Protestant dissent and to convince or compel her subjects to return to Catholic practice. The first steps in Mary's Catholic restoration were relatively gentle. The new prayer book that had been introduced during Edward VI's reign was abolished, and the old Latin Mass was restored. Married clergy, who had been allowed to keep their wives during the Protestant reforms, were now required to put away their wives or lose their positions. Protestant bishops who refused to accept the restoration of Catholicism were removed from their positions and replaced with Catholic bishops. These changes caused grumbling and discontent among committed Protestants, but they did not involve widespread violence or persecution. However, as Mary's reign progressed, and as it became clear that a significant portion of the English population was not willingly accepting the return to Catholicism, the government's approach became harsher. Mary and her advisors concluded that more forceful measures were necessary to root out Protestant heresy and to ensure that England returned fully to the Catholic faith. This led to the beginning of the Protestant persecution that would earn Mary the nickname Bloody Mary. and would stain her reputation for centuries to come. The burnings began in February of 1555, when the first Protestant martyrs were executed for heresy by being burned at the stake at Smithfield in London. The victims were men and women who refused to recant their Protestant beliefs, who insisted that the Catholic Mass was a blasphemous mockery of Christ's sacrifice, who denied transubstantiation and the other doctrines of Catholic theology, and who chose death rather than compromise their faith. The executions were public spectacles, intended to serve as warnings to others who might be tempted to persist in heresy, and they were carried out with the full approval and encouragement of Queen Mary and her bishops over the next 3.5 years, until Mary's death in November of 1558. Approximately 283 Protestants would be burned at the stake for heresy in England. The victims included prominent religious leaders like Thomas Cranmer, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, who had annulled King Henry VIII's first marriage and who had been instrumental in creating the English Protestant Church, as well as humble tradesmen, farmers, women, and even a few children. The burnings took place not only in London, but in towns and cities throughout England, particularly in the southeast, where Protestant sentiment was strongest. The smoke from the execution fires became a symbol of Mary's reign, and the blood of the martyrs became the seed of Protestant resistance that would flourish after Mary's death. For Katherine Grey, living at Mary's court and attending the Queen as a maid of honour, the burnings must have been both terrifying and heartbreaking. Katherine knew that her own beliefs, if they were discovered and if she refused to recant, could lead her to the same fate as these martyrs. She had to maintain absolute secrecy about her religious convictions, attending Mass with apparent devotion, confessing her sins to Catholic priests, receiving the Eucharist according to Catholic rites, all while secretly believing that these practices were wrong and spiritually dangerous. This sort of religious dissimulation, pretending to be Catholic while remaining Protestant at heart, was common among English Protestants during Mary's reign, but it required constant vigilance and created enormous psychological stress. The martyrs who chose to die rather than dissimulate represented both an inspiration and a reproach to those like Catherine, who chose survival through outward conformity. The martyrs demonstrated extraordinary courage and faith, witnessing to their beliefs even in the face of the most horrible death imaginable. Their example encouraged other Protestants to remain firm in their faith and helped ensure that Protestantism would survive Mary's persecution. But their choice also implicitly criticized those who saved themselves through dissimulation, suggesting that true faith required public witness rather than private belief. Catherine, attending Mass and conforming outwardly to Catholicism, while her co-religionists burned for refusing to do the same, must have wrestled with guilt and with questions about her own courage and commitment. The one consolation during these difficult years was that Catherine was not herself the immediate heir to the throne, and therefore did not face the intense scrutiny that might have made her position even more dangerous. Princess Elizabeth, Mary's younger half-sister, was now Mary's heir presumptive, and it was Elizabeth who bore the burden of being constantly watched, constantly suspected of involvement in Protestant plots, constantly at risk of arrest and execution if she gave Mary any reason to doubt her loyalty. Catherine could remain in relative obscurity, neither important enough to be a major threat, nor insignificant enough to be completely forgotten. Elizabeth herself navigated these dangerous years with extraordinary skill and caution. She conformed outwardly to Catholicism, attending Mass and performing the religious duties expected of her, but she did so in a way that suggested reluctance and minimal compliance, rather than genuine devotion. She avoided committing herself to any Protestant conspiracies, while also avoiding any actions that would alienate the Protestant faction that saw her as their hope for the future. When accused of involvement in various plots, she defended herself with a combination of righteous indignation and careful legalism, insisting on her innocence and her loyalty to Queen Mary, while never quite admitting that Mary's religious policies were correct, or that she herself had truly converted to Catholicism in her heart. It was a masterful performance of political theatre, and it kept Elizabeth alive through Mary's dangerous reign. Catherine probably watched Elizabeth's careful dance with a mixture of admiration and perhaps envy. Elizabeth was doing what Catherine herself was doing, surviving through outward conformity while maintaining private dissent. But Elizabeth was doing it on a much larger stage and with much higher stakes. If Elizabeth made a mistake, if she was caught in a genuine conspiracy, if Mary decided that the risk of allowing her to live was too great, then Elizabeth would lose her head and the Protestant cause would lose its greatest hope. But Elizabeth survived, maintaining her precarious position through a combination of luck, skill, and sheer determination. The Grey family continued to live under the cloud of suspicion and disgrace throughout the early years of Mary's reign. Jane remained imprisoned in the Tower, her future uncertain. Francis continued at court, trying to rebuild the family's position through loyal service to Queen Mary. Catherine and her younger sister Mary served as maids of honour, doing their best to be useful and unobtrusive, avoiding any actions that might bring them to the Queen's hostile attention. And Henry Grey, Duke of Suffolk, tried to demonstrate his loyalty to the new regime while chafing under the restrictions and the humiliation of his reduced circumstances. But Henry Grey's attempt to rebuild his position and to demonstrate his loyalty would be fatally undermined by his own poor judgment and his inability to stay out of politics. In January of 1554, just 6 months after Mary's accession to the throne, a rebellion broke out that would bring disaster to the Grey family and would claim the lives of both Jane Grey and Henry Grey himself. The rebellion that erupted in January of 1554 was ostensibly a protest against Queen Mary's plan to marry Philip of Spain, the son and heir of the Emperor Charles V. Mary had decided to marry Philip as part of an alliance with the Habsburg dynasty that would strengthen Catholic England and provide Mary with a husband who could father the Catholic heir she desperately wanted. But the marriage was deeply unpopular in England, where people feared that it would make England subordinate to Spain and would drag England into Spain's wars and conflicts. The announcement of the marriage plan provided an opportunity for Protestant malcontents who had been forced into submission by Mary's accession to rise up once again, this time in the name of defending England's independence rather than in the name of religion. The rebellion was led by Sir Thomas Wyatt, a gentleman from Kent who had supported the Protestant cause and who organised an uprising in the counties of Kent and surrounding areas. Wyatt claimed that his goal was to prevent the Spanish marriage and to protect English liberties, and he attracted considerable support from people who were concerned about foreign influence in England. But Mary and her advisors recognized that the rebellion was really aimed at overthrowing Mary herself and replacing her with Princess Elizabeth, who was Protestant and who would not marry a Spanish prince. Henry Grey, Duke of Suffolk, Catherine's father, made the catastrophic decision to join Wyatt's rebellion. Exactly why Henry made this choice remains unclear to historians. Perhaps he genuinely believed that the Spanish marriage was dangerous and needed to be prevented. Perhaps he thought that Wyatt's rebellion had a real chance of success and wanted to position himself on the winning side. Perhaps he was frustrated by his reduced circumstances and saw the rebellion as an opportunity to restore his fortunes. Perhaps he was simply a poor judge of political situations and made a mistake that cost him his life. Whatever his motivations, Henry Grey left his home and travelled to the Midlands, where he attempted to raise forces to support Wyatt's rebellion. The attempt was a complete failure. Henry was unable to convince any significant number of men to join his cause, and when Mary's forces came to arrest him, he was forced to flee and hide. According to contemporary accounts, Henry hid in a hollow tree on his estate at Astley, a humiliating position for a Duke of England, before being discovered and arrested. He was taken to London, imprisoned in the Tower alongside his daughter Jane, and charged with high treason for his participation in the rebellion. Wyatt's rebellion itself was also a failure. Wyatt's forces marched on London, and for a brief moment it seemed they might succeed in entering the city and seizing control of the government. But Queen Mary rallied her supporters with a powerful speech at the Guildhall in London, where she declared her determination to defend her throne and her right to marry whom she chose. The Londoners remained loyal to Mary. Wyatt's assault on the city failed, and the rebel leader was captured and executed. The rebellion was over within a month of its beginning, and Mary's government set about punishing those who had participated. For Jane Grey, Wyatt's rebellion spelled doom. As long as Jane remained alive, she represented a potential figurehead for Protestant rebellion, a rival claimant to the throne around whom malcontents could gather. Mary had been inclined to show mercy to Jane, recognizing that the young woman had not sought the crown and had been manipulated by others. But Mary's advisors convinced her that Jane could not be allowed to live after her father had joined a rebellion against Mary's government. If the rebels had succeeded, they would certainly have attempted to restore Jane to the throne, and as long as Jane lived, there would always be the possibility of future rebellions in her name. For the safety and security of Mary's government, Jane had to die. On the 12th of February, 1554, Lady Jane Grey was executed at the Tower of London. She was probably 16 or 17 years old, though her exact age remains uncertain. Rather than being executed publicly on Tower Hill, where common criminals and traitors were beheaded, Jane was granted the privilege of a private execution on Tower Green, within the Tower precincts, in recognition of her royal blood. Her husband, Lord Guildford Dudley, was executed the same morning on Tower Hill, and Jane may have watched from her window as his body was carried back to the Tower on a cart, wrapped in a blood-stained cloth. Jane faced her death with extraordinary courage and dignity. She made a brief speech from the scaffold, acknowledging her fault in accepting the crown, but maintaining her Protestant faith and forgiving those who had brought her to this end. She recited Psalm 51, the penitential psalm that begins, "Have mercy upon me, O God, according to thy loving kindness," and she prayed aloud for strength to face death with courage. Then she knelt at the block and placed her neck in position. Because she was blindfolded, she momentarily fumbled to find the block, crying out, "What shall I do? Where is it?" until someone guided her hands. The executioner struck with his axe, and with a single blow, Jane's head was severed from her body. Her remains were buried without ceremony in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, the small chapel within the Tower grounds, where many Tower prisoners found their final rest. 10 days later, on the 22nd of February, Catherine's father, Henry Grey, Duke of Suffolk, was also executed on Tower Hill for his part in Wyatt's rebellion. Unlike Jane, Henry did not face death with notable courage or dignity. He seems to have broken down under the stress of his imprisonment and impending execution, and his final speech from the scaffold was confused and rambling. He was 46 years old, and his execution left his wife Frances a widow and his 2 remaining daughters, Catherine and Mary, fatherless. The Grey family's fortunes had reached their lowest point. Jane dead, Henry dead, Francis widowed, Catherine and Mary tainted by association with treason, the family wealth depleted by fines and confiscations, the family name synonymous with rebellion and failure. For Catherine, who was now 13 years old, the execution of her sister and her father must have been devastating. She had lost Jane, her brilliant older sister, who had been queen for 9 days before becoming a prisoner and martyr. She had lost her father, however flawed his judgment had been, who had raised her and provided for her, and who had shared her Protestant faith. She had watched as her family was destroyed by the political and religious conflicts that were tearing England apart, and she must have wondered what the future held for her and her younger sister, 2 girls of royal blood living in a Catholic realm that had every reason to view them with suspicion and hostility. Yet once again, Queen Mary showed unexpected mercy to the surviving members of the Grey family. Frances Brandon Grey was allowed to remain at court despite her daughter's execution and her husband's treasonous rebellion. Mary seems to have recognized that Frances had not been involved in either the plot to make Jane queen or the Wyatt rebellion, and the Queen showed some sympathy for a woman who had lost both her husband and her eldest daughter in such tragic circumstances. Mary allowed Frances to remain in her service, and Frances even received some financial support from the Queen to help offset the economic devastation that the family had suffered. Catherine and Mary Grey, the 2 surviving daughters, also remained at court as maids of honor to Queen Mary. Their presence at court served multiple purposes. It allowed Mary to keep an eye on them and to ensure that they were not becoming involved in any Protestant plots against her government. It also provided them with a home and an income when their own family resources had been reduced to almost nothing. And perhaps Mary felt some genuine compassion for the 2 young women whose lives had been so disrupted by events beyond their control. To further ensure the good behavior of the Grey family, and perhaps also to provide Frances and her daughters with a measure of protection, Mary arranged for Catherine to be placed in the household of Anne Seymour, Dowager Duchess of Somerset. Anne was the widow of Edward Seymour, the Lord Protector who had been executed in 1552, and she was the mother of several children, including that Edward Seymour, who had recently inherited his father's secondary title of Earl of Hertford. The Duchess of Somerset was a formidable woman, known for her strong personality, her intelligence, and her fierce loyalty to her family's memory and reputation. She had never accepted that her husband was guilty of the crimes for which he was executed, and she maintained a somewhat oppositional stance toward the government, even while being careful not to step too far out of line. The placement of Catherine in the Somerset household created a connection between the Grey family and the Seymour family, both of which had suffered from the political upheavals of recent years. Both families had lost fathers to the executioner's axe. Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, had been executed in 1552, and Henry Grey, Duke of Suffolk, had been executed in 1554. Both families retained some prestige and connection to the royal family despite their disgrace. The Seymours through their relationship to Jane Seymour, King Henry VIII's third wife and mother of King Edward VI, and the Greys through their descent from Mary Tudor, Henry V's younger sister. Both families were Protestant in their religious sympathies, though they had to be careful about expressing those sympathies too openly in Mary's Catholic England. Catherine spent time with the Duchess of Somerset and her children during the years of Mary's reign, forming friendships and connections that would prove fatally important in her future. Among the Somerset children was a young man named Edward Seymour, who had been born around 1539 or 1540, making him approximately Catherine's age, or perhaps a year or two older. This Edward Seymour, not to be confused with his father, the executed Lord Protector, had inherited his father's lesser title of Earl of Hertford, though the higher title of Duke of Somerset had been forfeited as a result of his father's attainder for treason. Young Edward was handsome, charming, and accomplished in all the courtly arts, and he would one day capture Catherine's heart in a romance that would bring her both the greatest happiness and the deepest suffering of her life. But all of that lay in the future. During the years of Mary's reign, Catherine was focused on survival, on maintaining the careful facade of Catholic conformity while preserving her Protestant faith internally, on serving Queen Mary dutifully while hoping for the day when the religious situation might change. She continued her education, practiced her music and needlework, attended the Queen at Court ceremonies and festivals, and tried to remain as inconspicuous as possible given her family's dangerous history and her own position in the succession. For Catherine was once again, or perhaps still, in the line of succession to the English throne, though this was a position fraught with danger rather than honour. With Jane dead, Catherine was now the eldest surviving grandchild of Mary Tudor, Duchess of Suffolk, and under the terms of King Henry VIII's will, she stood in the succession after Mary and Elizabeth. If Queen Mary died without children, and as the years passed, this seemed increasingly likely, as Mary's supposed pregnancies turned out to be false hopes, and if something then happened to Princess Elizabeth, then Catherine would be next in line for the throne. This was not a comfortable position to occupy, for it made Catherine a potential threat to both Mary and Elizabeth, a potential figurehead for conspiracies and rebellions, a person who could never be allowed to live freely or to marry without royal permission. The summer and autumn of 1558 brought increasingly clear signs that Queen Mary's health was failing. Mary had never recovered fully from the disappointment of her false pregnancies, the phantom conditions that had made her believe she was carrying the Catholic heir she desperately wanted, when in fact there was no child, the realization that she would never have children, that her work of restoring Catholicism to England would be undone by her Protestant half-sister Elizabeth, seems to have broken something inside Mary. She grew increasingly melancholic, her health declined, and by October of 1558, it was clear that she was dying. Queen Mary of England died at St. James's Palace in London on the 17th of November 1558, possibly from cancer, possibly from influenza, possibly from some other ailment that 16th century medicine could not diagnose or treat. She was 42 years old, and she had reigned for 5 years and 4 months. Her reign, which had begun with such hope among English Catholics, ended in failure and disappointment. She had restored Catholicism, but only temporarily, and at the cost of burning hundreds of Protestants, earning herself the nickname Bloody Mary that would blacken her reputation for centuries. She had married Philip of Spain, but the marriage had brought her no happiness and no children, and Philip had spent most of their marriage away from England, pursuing his own political and military goals in Europe. She died believing she had failed in her mission, and she was probably correct in that belief. The throne passed peacefully to Elizabeth, who became Queen Elizabeth II at the age of 25. The accession was greeted with joy and relief by England's Protestant population, who saw Elizabeth as their deliverer from Catholic persecution and their hope for a restored Protestant church. Church bells rang throughout London, bonfires were lit in celebration, and people poured into the streets to celebrate the beginning of what they hoped would be a new golden age. Elizabeth herself moved cautiously, understanding that she had inherited a divided nation with deep religious conflicts, and that she would need to proceed carefully to establish her authority and to create a religious settlement that could satisfy as many of her subjects as possible. For Catherine Grey, Elizabeth's accession brought both hope and fear. On one hand, Elizabeth was Protestant, and her accession meant that Catherine would no longer have to hide her religious beliefs or to dissimulate by attending Catholic services. The burnings would stop, the persecution would end, and England would return to Protestant practice. This was cause for genuine joy and relief. On the other hand, Elizabeth's accession created a new and dangerous dynamic in Catherine's relationship with the Queen. Catherine was now third in line to the throne, behind Elizabeth herself and behind Mary Stuart, the Queen of Scots, though many Protestant Englishmen disputed Mary Stuart's claim. If Elizabeth died without children, Catherine might well become queen, and this made Catherine simultaneously valuable and dangerous in Elizabeth's eyes. From the very beginning of her reign, Elizabeth made clear her personal feelings about Catherine. Contemporary observers noted that Elizabeth could not abide the sight of Katherine Grey, a visceral dislike that had multiple sources. Elizabeth was sensitive about questions of legitimacy. Her own mother had been executed for adultery, and Elizabeth had spent years under the shadow of bastardy and the taint of her mother's supposed crimes. Catherine, by contrast, was unquestionably legitimate, descended through an unbroken line of lawful marriages from King Henry VII. This alone might have been enough to make Elizabeth resentful, but there were other factors as well. Catherine was beautiful, possessing the characteristic red-gold Tudor hair, the fair complexion, and the delicate features that marked her as a member of the royal family. She was also 7 years younger than Elizabeth, possessed of the bloom of youth and the fresh beauty that Elizabeth, though handsome in her own right, could not quite match, and Catherine had been raised to view Elizabeth with contempt, as the illegitimate daughter of a woman executed for adultery and treason, as someone who had no right to stand in the succession ahead of the legitimate Grey line. In 1559, Catherine made the serious error of speaking very arrogant and unseemly words about Elizabeth in the hearing of the Queen and others, though the exact nature of these words has not been preserved. Whatever Catherine said, it was insulting enough to inflame Elizabeth's already considerable dislike, and to mark Catherine as someone who would never be trusted or favoured. Despite Elizabeth's personal animosity, Catherine was appointed as a maid of honour to the new Queen, a position that placed her in close proximity to Elizabeth and kept her under constant surveillance. As a maid of honour, Catherine was expected to attend Elizabeth daily, to help her dress, to accompany her to public ceremonies, to provide companionship and service, and to be always available when the Queen required her presence. It was an exhausting and demanding position, requiring constant alertness and perfect behaviour, for any misstep could result in royal displeasure and punishment. The relationship between Elizabeth and Catherine during these early years of Elizabeth's reign was fraught with unspoken tensions and careful words. Elizabeth watched Catherine constantly, alert for any sign that her cousin might be plotting against her, or might be allowing herself to become the focus of conspiracies by those who opposed Elizabeth's rule. Catherine, for her part, tried to be unobtrusive and obedient, understanding that she was living under the hostile gaze of a queen who viewed her as a threat. The situation was made worse by the fact that Elizabeth showed no inclination to marry and produce an heir who would secure the succession, meaning that Catherine remained uncomfortably close to the throne, with no prospect of being displaced by Elizabeth's own children. The pressure on Elizabeth to marry was intense. Her Privy Council begged her to choose a husband and to produce heirs. Parliament petitioned her to marry. Foreign princes and English nobles alike sought her hand, but Elizabeth consistently refused to commit to any marriage, offering various excuses and justifications, but never actually agreeing to marry anyone. Some historians believe that Elizabeth had made a private vow never to marry, perhaps from fear of childbirth, which was genuinely dangerous in the 16th century, perhaps from a desire to remain independent and avoid sharing power with a husband, perhaps from some psychological damage related to her mother's execution and her own childhood experiences. Whatever her reasons, Elizabeth's refusal to marry meant that the succession remained unsettled and that Catherine remained a potential heir whose very existence was a source of anxiety for the Queen. Within the court, there was considerable speculation about Catherine's marriage prospects. As a potential heir to the throne, her choice of husband carried enormous political implications. Various foreign princes and English nobles were suggested as possible husbands for Catherine, but Elizabeth showed no interest in arranging any such marriage. The Queen preferred to keep Catherine unmarried and therefore less dangerous, even as the pressure mounted for Elizabeth herself to marry and produce an heir who would make worrying about Catherine unnecessary. In 1559, there were even rumours of a Spanish plot to marry Catherine to Don Carlos, the son and heir of King Philip II of Spain. Philip had been married to Queen Mary and was therefore Elizabeth's brother-in-law, and he retained an interest in English politics and religion. The Habsburgs, the great Catholic dynasty to which Philip belonged, were hostile to the claims of Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, because Mary was married to the French Dauphin, and France was Spain's traditional enemy. From the Spanish perspective, Katherine Grey represented a potentially more attractive claimant to the English throne than Mary Stuart, and they may have contemplated supporting Catherine's claim if Elizabeth died, or if circumstances allowed them to overthrow Elizabeth. These Spanish intrigues came to nothing, but they served to heighten Elizabeth's suspicions about Catherine, and to make the Queen even more determined to keep her cousin under close control. It was during this tense period, probably in late 1559 or early 1560, that Catherine formed a close friendship with a young woman named Lady Jane Seymour. Jane Seymour, not to be confused with King Henry VIII's third wife of the same name, was the daughter of Edward Seymour, the executed Lord Protector, and therefore the sister of Edward Seymour, Earl of Hertford. Lady Jane Seymour and Katherine Grey had probably known each other during the period when Catherine had been placed in the Somerset household during Mary's reign, and they had formed a genuine friendship based on their shared Protestant faith, their similar ages, and their common experiences of family tragedy and political upheaval. Through her friendship with Lady Jane Seymour, Catherine came to know Jane's brother, Edward Seymour, Earl of Hertford, more intimately. Edward had grown into a handsome and accomplished young man, skilled in all the courtly arts that a nobleman needed to master. He could dance with grace, he could converse wittily, he could ride and hunt and fence. He was well educated, having received the sort of humanist education that was fashionable among the nobility, and he had inherited from his father's family the connections to royalty. His uncle had been Queen Jane Seymour, King Henry VIII's beloved third wife, making Edward a first cousin of the late King Edward VI. The attraction between Catherine and Edward seems to have developed naturally out of their friendship and their frequent contact at court. Catherine, now 19 years old, was at an age when thoughts of love and marriage naturally occupied the minds of young women. She had been briefly married at age 12, but that marriage had been annulled before it was consummated, so she had never experienced married life or romantic love. Edward Seymour, about a year or two older than Catherine, was also at the age when young men began to think seriously about marriage and establishing their own households. Their romance probably began cautiously, with stolen glances and careful words, with meetings that seemed accidental but were actually planned, with all the small signs and signals by which young people communicate their attraction to each other while trying to maintain public propriety. Edward was apparently careful at first, understanding the enormous risks involved in pursuing a relationship with Katherine Grey. She was a member of the royal family, a potential heir to the throne, and any man who married her without the Queen's permission would be committing a serious crime, possibly treason. At one point, Edward seems to have had second thoughts and even attempted to distance himself from Catherine by flirting with another young woman, trying to convince himself and others that he was not seriously interested in Katherine Grey. But Catherine was heartbroken by Edward's apparent abandonment of their budding romance. She wrote to him, expressing her feelings and her distress at his withdrawal. This letter must have moved Edward deeply, convincing him that Catherine's affection was genuine and strong. Unable to resist his own feelings and touched by Catherine's obvious devotion, Edward abandoned his attempt at prudence and committed himself fully to the relationship. He decided that he would marry Katherine Grey, regardless of the risks, regardless of the Queen's likely fury, regardless of the consequences that might follow. Edward Seymour was in France, far from England, and unaware of the catastrophe that had befallen his wife, when urgent messages arrived summoning him home. The messengers sent by Queen Elizabeth's government found Edward in Paris, or perhaps in one of the other French cities he was visiting as part of his educational tour. The messages were terse and commanding. Edward was to return to England immediately. No explanation was given for why his presence was required so urgently, but the tone of the summons made clear that this was not a request, but an order that could not be refused. Edward must have known as soon as he received the summons that something had gone terribly wrong. Perhaps Catherine's pregnancy had been discovered. Perhaps their secret marriage had been revealed. Perhaps some other disaster had occurred that required his immediate return. Whatever the specific cause, Edward understood that he was returning to England to face serious trouble. He packed his belongings, said hasty farewells to Thomas Cecil, and to whatever friends and acquaintances he had made in France, and began the journey back across the Channel to England. The journey home would have taken several days, and during that time, Edward must have been consumed with worry and fear. He worried about Catherine. Was she safe? Had she been arrested? How was she coping with whatever situation had developed in his absence? He worried about their marriage. Had it been discovered? Would they be able to prove its validity? What would happen to them if the Queen refused to recognize their union? And he worried about himself. Would he be imprisoned, executed, stripped of his titles and lands? The Tudor regime had a long history of dealing harshly with those who married into the royal family without permission, and Edward knew that he might be facing the worst consequences imaginable. When Edward arrived back in England, probably in late August or early September of 1561, he was immediately taken into custody. There was no opportunity for him to see Catherine. No chance for them to coordinate their stories or to comfort each other. Instead, Edward was brought before the Privy Council for interrogation, just as Catherine had been interrogated weeks earlier. The councillors questioned Edward about every aspect of his relationship with Katherine Grey. When had they first met? When had their romantic involvement begun? Who had known about their relationship? Who had helped arrange their marriage? When exactly had the marriage taken place? Where? Who had performed the ceremony? Who had witnessed it? Edward answered these questions honestly, confirming Catherine's account of their secret marriage in December of 1560 at his house in Cannon Row. He described how his sister, Lady Jane Seymour, had been the only witness, and how a priest whose name he did not know or would not reveal had performed the ceremony. He explained that he had given Catherine a document proving their marriage, though he learned from his interrogators that Catherine had lost this crucial piece of evidence. Edward's answers corroborated Catherine's story in all essential details. which might have been taken as evidence that they were telling the truth. But to Elizabeth's government, the consistency of their stories was not necessarily proof of honesty. It could equally well be evidence that they had carefully rehearsed a full story to conceal the true nature of their relationship. The fundamental problem was that Edward and Catherine could not produce the evidence that would have proved their marriage beyond doubt. The priest who had performed the ceremony could not be found, or perhaps had fled England to avoid being caught up in this dangerous situation. Lady Jane Seymour, the sole witness, had died of tuberculosis in the summer of 1561. Taking her testimony to the grave, the written document that Edward had given Catherine as proof of marriage had been lost, destroyed, or stolen, and could not be produced. Without these three crucial pieces of evidence, priest, witness, or document, proving the validity of the marriage was extremely difficult, and Edward and Catherine's unsupported word would not be sufficient to convince a hostile government. After his interrogation, Edward Seymour was formally committed to the Tower of London, just as Catherine had been. He was escorted to the fortress on the Thames and taken to chambers that had been prepared for him, becoming a prisoner alongside his wife, though they were kept strictly separated. The lieutenant of the Tower at this time was Sir Edward Warner, who had been appointed to this important position by Queen Elizabeth, and who was responsible for the custody and care of high-status prisoners held in the royal fortress. The Tower of London in 1561 was an ancient and imposing structure, a complex of buildings surrounded by massive stone walls and protected by a moat that could be filled with water from the Thames. The tower had served many purposes over the centuries, since William the Conqueror had first built the White Tower at its centre in the 11th century. It was a royal palace where monarchs traditionally spent the night before their coronation, and where they maintained apartments for state occasions. It was an armory and arsenal storing weapons and military equipment. It was a treasury where the crown jewels and other valuable items were kept under heavy guard. It was a royal mint where coins were produced. And it was a prison, particularly for high-status prisoners accused of treason or other serious crimes against the crown. The tower had held many famous prisoners over the centuries, and the stones of its walls and chambers seemed to echo with the ghosts of those who had suffered and died there. Catherine and Edward's own relatives numbered among those ghosts. Lady Jane Grey, Catherine's sister, had been imprisoned in the tower before her execution in 1554, and her blood still stained the scaffold on Tower Green where she had been beheaded. Edward's uncle, Thomas Seymour, had been imprisoned in the tower before his execution in 1549. The tower represented royal power and royal justice, but it also represented danger and the possibility of death for those who had offended the monarch. Yet imprisonment in the tower did not necessarily mean harsh physical conditions, at least not for prisoners of high status like Catherine and Edward. The tower contained many chambers and apartments, and prisoners of royal or noble blood were typically housed in relatively comfortable surroundings with access to servants, books, writing materials, and other amenities that made their captivity bearable, if not pleasant. They were prisoners, certainly, denied their freedom and subject to the Queen's pleasure for how long their imprisonment would last. But they were not thrown into dungeons or subjected to physical torture unless they were suspected of specific crimes that required interrogation. Catherine's chambers in the tower were furnished with items from the royal wardrobe, the storehouse of furniture, tapestries, and household goods that belonged to the crown, and that could be used to furnish royal residences or to provide for prisoners of high status. Catherine's rooms would have included a bed with hangings for warmth and privacy, chairs and tables for sitting and eating, chests for storage of her clothing and personal belongings, and tapestries on the walls to provide decoration and insulation against the cold stone. She was allowed to have servants to attend to her needs, to prepare her food, to help her dress, and to provide companionship in her isolation. Catherine was even allowed to keep her pets with her in the tower, the small dogs that she loved and the mischievous monkey that had been her companion at court. These animals must have provided some comfort and companionship during her lonely imprisonment, though they also caused some problems. Sir Edward Warner, the lieutenant of the tower, later reported to the government that Catherine's pet monkey had damaged some of the furnishings in her chambers, tearing tapestries or breaking furniture in the way that monkeys sometimes do when they are confined in spaces too small for their natural energy and curiosity. The image of Katherine Grey in the tower, attended by her servants and surrounded by her pets, is both touching and sad. She had some of the comforts of her former life, but she was still a prisoner, still separated from her husband, still facing an uncertain future. Edward's chambers were in a different part of the tower, far enough from Catherine's rooms that they could not see or speak to each other under normal circumstances. The government wanted to keep them separated, both to prevent them from coordinating their stories if further interrogation became necessary, and to prevent them from conceiving any additional children that might complicate the succession situation even further. Edward's chambers were probably similarly furnished to Catherine's, with the comforts appropriate to a prisoner of noble rank. But he was kept under guard and was not allowed to leave his rooms or to communicate with his wife. The separation must have been agonizing for both of them. Catherine was heavily pregnant, approaching the time when she would give birth to their child, and she faced this prospect without her husband by her side to offer comfort and support. Edward was tormented by the knowledge that Catherine was somewhere in the same fortress, perhaps just a few hundred feet away, yet he was unable to reach her or to help her. Both of them must have worried constantly about what would happen to them, whether they would ever be released, whether they would ever be allowed to live together as husband and wife, whether their child would be recognized as legitimate or would be declared a bastard. As September progressed, Catherine's pregnancy entered its final stage. She had been in the tower for about a month, living in her furnished chambers under the watchful eyes of her guards and attended by her servants. The birth was approaching, and preparations were made for the delivery. In the 16th century, childbirth was exclusively the domain of women. Midwives and female attendants helped with the delivery, while men, even including the father, were excluded from the birthing chamber. This meant that Edward would not be present when Catherine gave birth, even if he had been free to be with her, though the fact that they were imprisoned separately made the point moot. The birthing chamber was prepared according to the customs of the time. The windows were covered with heavy fabrics to exclude drafts, which were believed to be dangerous to both mother and child. Candles provided light in the darkened room. Clean linens were prepared for the birth. A midwife, experienced in the art of assisting women through labor and delivery, was brought in to supervise the birth. Female servants and attendants gathered to help as needed. The chamber would have been warm, close, and intimate, a space exclusively for women engaged in the ancient and universal drama of bringing new life into the world. Catherine went into labor on the 20th or 21st of September, 1561. The labor probably lasted for many hours, as was typical for first-time mothers, and Catherine endured the pain and exhaustion of bringing her child into the world surrounded by her attendants, but without her husband's presence or support. The midwife guided Catherine through the stages of labor, encouraging her to push when the time came, offering what comfort and assistance she could, and finally helping to deliver the baby when it emerged from Catherine's body. The child was a boy, healthy and strong, crying lustily as he took his first breath of air. For Catherine, exhausted from labour but filled with joy and relief at her son's safe delivery, this moment must have been bittersweet. She had a son, a beautiful baby boy, who represented the fruit of her love for Edward, but she could not share this moment with her husband, and she did not know what the future held for her child, or for herself. The baby was cleaned and wrapped in swaddling cloths, the tight wrapping that was believed to help babies' limbs grow straight and strong, and he was placed in Catherine's arms so that she could hold him and feed him for the first time. The baby was given his father's name, Edward Seymour, as the son of an earl, even though he was born in prison and even though questions hung over his legitimacy. The baby was given the courtesy title of Lord Beauchamp, Beauchamp being one of the subsidiary titles associated with the Hertford earldom. So the child was known as Edward Seymour, Lord Beauchamp, though history would sometimes refer to him simply as Lord Beauchamp, to distinguish him from his father, also named Edward Seymour. 3 days after his birth, on the 24th of September, 1561, baby Edward was baptized in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, the ancient chapel within the Tower of London that served as the place of worship for the Tower's residents and garrison. This chapel held enormous emotional significance for Catherine's family, for beneath its floor lay buried the body of her sister, Lady Jane Grey, executed 7 years earlier. The chapel's very name, St. Peter in Chains, seemed grimly appropriate for a christening that took place while the baby's parents were imprisoned. The baptism would have been a simple but solemn ceremony, following the rites of the Church of England as they had been established under Queen Elizabeth. The baby, dressed in white christening robes, would have been carried to the chapel by his godparents or by the midwife who had attended his birth. The chaplain serving the Tower would have performed the ceremony, taking the baby and dipping him 3 times in the baptismal font filled with holy water, once for each person of the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Edward, I baptize thee in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost, the chaplain would have intoned, making the sign of the cross on the baby's forehead with the holy water. The baby would have been given godparents who stood as witnesses to his baptism and who promised to help ensure his Christian upbringing. We do not know who these godparents were, though they were probably courtiers or Tower officials who agreed to fulfill this role. After the baptism, the baby was dressed again in his swaddling clothes and returned to his mother's care in her chambers. Catherine could now feed her son, care for him, watch him sleep and wake and begin to grow, finding in him some purpose and meaning in her otherwise hopeless situation. But even as Catherine held her newborn son and found some comfort in motherhood, the situation surrounding her imprisonment was developing in ominous ways. Queen Elizabeth was not satisfied with simply having Catherine and Edward imprisoned in the Tower. The Queen wanted a formal determination that their supposed marriage was invalid, that Catherine and Edward were not truly husband and wife, and that their child was therefore illegitimate and had no claim to the throne. To accomplish this, Elizabeth established an ecclesiastical commission to investigate the marriage and to rule on its validity. In January of 1562, Queen Elizabeth established an ecclesiastical commission with the specific purpose of examining whether a valid marriage had taken place between Katherine Grey and Edward Seymour. The commission was chaired by Matthew Parker, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who was the highest-ranking clergyman in England and who was generally loyal to Queen Elizabeth and supportive of her policies. The other members of the commission were also churchmen, who understood what verdict the Queen expected them to reach. The commission's task was to apply the law of the Church regarding marriage to the facts of Catherine and Edward's case, and to determine whether those facts demonstrated that a valid marriage had occurred. Under canon law, the law of the Church regarding religious matters including marriage, a valid marriage required several elements. The couple had to be of legal age and free to marry, not already married to someone else, not related within the forbidden degrees of consanguinity, not bound by vows of celibacy. They had to exchange vows of marriage freely and willingly, and ideally, the marriage should be celebrated by a priest in the presence of witnesses. A clandestine marriage without proper witnesses or documentation was problematic and could potentially be challenged, though it was not automatically invalid if the couple could prove that vows had been exchanged. The commission summoned Catherine and Edward to give testimony about their marriage. Both of them repeated the story they had told during their initial interrogations. They had been married in late December of 1560 at Edward's house in Cannon Row. The ceremony had been performed by a priest whose identity they could not or would not reveal. Edward's sister, Lady Jane Seymour, had been the sole witness, and Edward had given Catherine a document attesting to the marriage, though Catherine had since lost it. The commission's problem was that none of this could be verified. The priest could not be produced to testify that he had indeed performed a marriage ceremony. Lady Jane Seymour could not testify because she was dead. The document that Edward had allegedly given Catherine could not be examined because it had been lost. There were no other witnesses to the ceremony who could corroborate Catherine and Edward's account. In effect, the only evidence for the marriage was the uncorroborated word of Catherine and Edward themselves, and this was not sufficient to establish the validity of a marriage when so much was at stake. The commission heard testimony from Catherine and Edward over a period of several months, giving them multiple opportunities to provide evidence or to produce witnesses who could support their claims. But no new evidence emerged, no witnesses came forward, and the lost document remained lost. The commission also investigated whether any conspiracy had surrounded the marriage, whether powerful nobles or foreign princes had encouraged or supported the match as part of a plot against Queen Elizabeth. This investigation turned up no evidence of any broader conspiracy, suggesting that Catherine and Edward had indeed married for personal reasons, rather than as part of some political scheme. In May of 1562, the Ecclesiastical Commission delivered its verdict. The commission ruled that no valid marriage had taken place between Katherine Grey and Edward Seymour. The ceremony that they claimed had occurred could not be proven to have happened, and even if it had happened, it was problematic because it lacked proper witnesses and documentation. The commission declared that Catherine and Edward were not married and had never been married. Their relationship was characterized not as marriage, but as carnal copulation and fornication, sexual relations between two people who were not married to each other. The implications of this verdict were profound and devastating. If Catherine and Edward were not married, then their son, Lord Beauchamp, was illegitimate, a bastard who had no right to inherit his father's titles or property, and who had no place in the succession to the throne. The baby born in the Tower of London on the 21st of September was not the legitimate heir of the Earl of Hertford and was not a potential claimant to the English crown. He was simply an illegitimate child, a bastard, his birth stained with the sin of his parents' fornication. For Catherine, the verdict must have been crushing. She knew in her heart that she was married to Edward, that they had exchanged vows before a priest, that their union was valid in the eyes of God, even if it could not be proven in the eyes of the church and state. She knew that her son was not a bastard, but was the legitimate child of a married couple who loved each other. But her knowledge meant nothing against the power of the Church Commission, backed by the authority of Queen Elizabeth. The verdict declared her an adulteress and her son a bastard. and there was nothing she could do to change that determination. Edward Seymour also suffered from the verdict, though in different ways. He was hauled before the Court of Star Chamber, a royal court that dealt with cases involving the monarch's prerogatives and that had the power to impose harsh punishments. The Star Chamber found Edward guilty on multiple charges related to his relationship with Catherine. The most serious charge was deflowering a virgin of the royal blood without the monarch's permission. In other words, having sexual relations with Catherine when she was a member of the royal family, and when such relations required royal consent. The Court of Star Chamber imposed a massive fine on Edward, £15,000, an absolutely enormous sum of money in the 16th century. To put this in perspective, £15,000 in 1562 would be equivalent to several £1 million in modern currency, perhaps as much as £5 or £10 million depending on how one calculates inflation over more than 4 centuries. This fine was not just a punishment, but was also intended as a deterrent, sending a message to any other nobleman who might consider marrying into the royal family without permission. The fine was so large that Edward could not possibly pay it all at once, and it would burden his finances for the rest of his life. The official charges against Edward were framed in terms of fornication rather than marriage, even though Edward insisted that he had been married to Catherine. From the government's perspective, this framing served multiple purposes. It avoided having to address the question of whether Edward had committed treason by marrying a potential heir to the throne without permission. Fornication was a serious crime, but it was not treason. It also reinforced the Commission's verdict that no marriage had taken place, treating Edward and Catherine's relationship as sexual misconduct rather than as an unauthorized but valid marriage. Despite these verdicts and punishments, Catherine and Edward remained in the Tower of London, their imprisonment continuing indefinitely. They were still kept separated, unable to see or communicate with each other except through intermediaries. Catherine had her son with her at least, and she could care for him and watch him grow, but she was denied the companionship of her husband and the chance to build the family life that she had imagined when she agreed to marry Edward in secret. Sir Edward Warner, the Lieutenant of the Tower, was a man of considerable compassion and humanity, qualities that were not always found among those who served in such positions of power and authority. Warner had been appointed by Queen Elizabeth to oversee the Tower and its prisoners, and he took his responsibilities seriously. But he also felt genuine sympathy for Katherine Grey and Edward Seymour, seeing them as a young couple who had married for love and who were being punished with excessive harshness for what Warner viewed as a relatively minor transgression. Warner could see that Catherine and Edward genuinely loved each other, that their marriage had been sincere rather than politically motivated, and that they were suffering terribly from their forced separation. The birth of their son and the Ecclesiastical Commission's harsh verdict declaring the child illegitimate must have moved Warner to pity. He decided, despite the explicit orders he had received to keep Catherine and Edward apart, that he would facilitate secret meetings between the imprisoned couple. It was a risky decision that could cost Warner his position and perhaps even his freedom if the Queen discovered what he was doing. But Warner apparently felt that compassion and decency required him to show this mercy to the young couple. How exactly Warner arranged these secret meetings is not recorded in detail, but there were several possibilities. He might have looked the other way when Edward found some excuse to leave his chambers and make his way to Catherine's rooms, claiming he was going to exercise in the Tower Gardens or to visit the chapel, or for some other innocent purpose. He might have arranged for Edward to be transferred temporarily to chambers closer to Catherine's, making it easier for them to meet without arousing suspicion from other Tower guards. He might have personally escorted Edward to Catherine's chambers at times when he knew that other officials would not be watching. However he managed it, Warner succeeded in allowing Catherine and Edward to see each other, to talk, to embrace, and to enjoy brief periods of conjugal intimacy during their long imprisonment. These secret meetings must have been precious to Catherine and Edward, offering them respite from the loneliness and despair of their separation. They could hold each other, talk about their son and watch him together, share their hopes and fears about the future, and find comfort in each other's presence. They could remind themselves that despite what the Ecclesiastical Commission had ruled, they were truly married, bound together by vows they had spoken and by love that continued to sustain them through their imprisonment. And they could express their love physically, coming together as husband and wife in the intimacy that was their right as a married couple, even if the world refused to recognize that marriage. The inevitable consequence of these conjugal visits was that Catherine became pregnant again. By late 1562, Catherine realized that she was expecting a second child. This should have been joyful news, a second son or perhaps a daughter to be a sibling to little Lord Beauchamp. But in the context of their imprisonment and the government's insistence that they were not married, Catherine's second pregnancy was a disaster that would bring terrible consequences for everyone involved. Catherine's pregnancy progressed through the winter of 1562 and into the early months of 1563. She must have tried to conceal it for as long as possible, but by early February, when she was well into her pregnancy, it could no longer be hidden. On the 10th or 11th of February, 1563, Catherine gave birth to her second son in the Tower of London. Like his older brother, this baby was healthy and strong, and he was given the name Thomas Seymour, perhaps in memory of Edward's uncle, the executed Thomas Seymour, or simply because it was a family name in the Seymour line. Baby Thomas was baptized on the 11th of February, 1563, just one day after his birth, in the same chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, where his brother had been christened 16 months earlier. This baptism was notable for the fact that two of the yeoman warders of the tower, the guards who were responsible for maintaining security and overseeing prisoners, stood as godfathers to the infant. This was an extraordinary gesture that showed the sympathy that even the common soldiers of the tower felt for Catherine and her children. These yeoman warders, who saw Catherine daily as she lived under their guard, who watched her care for her first son and then give birth to her second, apparently felt moved to show their support and compassion by agreeing to serve as godfathers to little Thomas Seymour. But while the yeoman warders showed compassion, Queen Elizabeth showed only fury when she learned of Catherine's second pregnancy and the birth of another son. The Spanish ambassador to England, who was well informed about court affairs and who observed Queen Elizabeth's reactions to important events, reported that when Elizabeth heard the news of the second birth, she turned the colour of a corpse, the same phrase he had used to describe her reaction to the news of Catherine's first pregnancy. Elizabeth's rage was so extreme that observers worried about her health and mental state. From Elizabeth's perspective, Catherine's second pregnancy was an outrageous affront and a confirmation of her worst suspicions. Here was Catherine, supposedly imprisoned and kept under guard, somehow managing to conceive a second child with Edward Seymour, proving that the security at the tower had been compromised and that someone had been allowing the couple to meet in defiance of the Queen's explicit orders. The second pregnancy also demonstrated that Catherine and Edward were determined to produce heirs, that they saw themselves as a married couple with the right to have children together, and that they refused to accept the Ecclesiastical Commission's verdict that they were not married. The birth of a second son also intensified Elizabeth's fears about the succession. Now there were two boys who could potentially claim to be legitimate heirs of Katherine Grey and Edward Seymour, two potential claimants to the throne if anyone chose to recognise Katherine and Edward's marriage as valid despite the Commission's ruling. Even though both boys had been declared illegitimate, they still represented a threat in Elizabeth's paranoid imagination. They were rallying points for conspiracies, potential figureheads for rebellions, dangers that needed to be eliminated, or at least contained. Elizabeth immediately ordered an investigation into how Katherine had become pregnant, while supposedly being kept separated from Edward. The investigation quickly revealed that Sir Edward Warner, the lieutenant of the Tower, had been facilitating secret meetings between the imprisoned couple. Warner was summoned before the Queen and the Privy Council to explain his conduct, and he admitted that he had allowed Katherine and Edward to see each other out of sympathy for their situation and belief that they were truly married, despite the Commission's ruling. Warner's admission brought swift consequences. He was dismissed from his position as Lieutenant of the Tower, losing a prestigious and lucrative office that he had held under the Queen's appointment. He was also called before the Court of Star Chamber to answer for his disobedience of the Queen's orders, and he was fined heavily for his misconduct. The exact amount of the fine is not recorded, but it was substantial enough to cause Warner significant financial hardship. Warner's punishment served as a warning to anyone else who might be tempted to show mercy to Katherine and Edward. Helping them would result in the loss of position, wealth, and royal favour. Edward Seymour was also punished again for the second pregnancy. He was hauled before the Star Chamber a second time and fined an additional £15,000, the same massive sum he had been fined the first time. This meant that Edward now owed a total of £30,000 in fines, an absolutely crushing financial burden that would take him decades to pay off and that would impoverish his family for generations. The repeated fines served both as punishment and as deterrent, demonstrating that each time Edward managed to father a child with Katherine, he would face ruinous financial consequences. The birth of Thomas Seymour and the discovery that Sir Edward Warner had been allowing conjugal visits between Katherine and Edward led Queen Elizabeth to make a final, cruel decision. Katherine and Edward would be permanently separated, removed from the Tower, where they had at least been in the same building, and placed in different locations miles apart, where there would be no possibility of them seeing each other ever again. In the summer or early autumn of 1563, the order was given to move Katherine and Edward out of the Tower of London. Katherine was to be placed under house arrest in the custody of her uncle, Sir John Grey, at his estate at Pergo in Essex. Edward was to be sent to live under the supervision of his mother, Anne Seymour, Dowager Duchess of Somerset, at her residence. Their two sons were to be separated from each other and from their mother. The elder boy, Lord Beauchamp, would go with his father to live with his grandmother, while the younger boy, Thomas, would be allowed to remain with his mother at Pergo. This separation was designed to be absolute and permanent. Katherine would never see her husband again. She would never see her elder son, Edward, Lord Beauchamp, grow from an infant into a child, and then into a young man. She would be allowed to keep Thomas with her as some small consolation, but she would lose everything else: her husband, her elder son, any hope of being reunited with the family she had created through her marriage to Edward Seymour. The journey from the Tower of London to Pergo must have been heartbreaking for Katherine. She left behind the rooms where she had spent 2 years of her life, where she had given birth to both her sons, where she had experienced brief moments of happiness during Edward's secret visits. She left behind her husband, whom she loved deeply and with whom she had hoped to build a life. And most painfully, she left behind her elder son, not quite 2 years old, a toddler who would have no memory of his mother and who would grow up knowing her only through stories and perhaps through occasional letters if any correspondence was permitted. Catherine arrived at Pyrgo in the custody of her uncle, Sir John Grey, carrying with her only her younger son Thomas, her personal belongings, her servants, and perhaps her pets, the dogs and monkey that had accompanied her through her imprisonment. Sir John Grey was a kinsman who had some family loyalty to Catherine, and he may have treated her with relative kindness during her time in his custody. But Catherine was still a prisoner, still under house arrest, still denied her freedom and forbidden from leaving the estate without permission. Pyrgo was a manor house in Essex, one of the many estates that belonged to the extended Grey family network. The house would have been comfortable, furnished in the style appropriate to a gentleman's country residence, with rooms for Catherine and her servants, gardens where she could walk when weather permitted, and the basic amenities of aristocratic life. But it was still a prison, no matter how comfortable its physical surroundings might be. Catherine could not leave, could not travel to see her husband or her elder son, could not return to court or to any normal life. She could only wait, day after day, week after week, month after month, hoping that eventually Queen Elizabeth might relent and show mercy. Catherine was allowed to keep Thomas with her, and caring for her younger son must have provided some purpose and comfort during these dark months. She could feed him, dress him, play with him, watch him learn to walk and talk, see his personality develop as he grew from infant to toddler. Thomas was her constant companion, the one person who loved her unconditionally and who needed her care. But even as she enjoyed Thomas's company, Catherine must have thought constantly about Edward, her elder son, wondering how he was growing, whether he was healthy, whether his grandmother was treating him well, whether he would remember anything of his mother when he grew old enough to have memories. Catherine also thought constantly about her husband, Edward Seymour, who was living under house arrest at his mother's residence, probably somewhere in the south of England. Catherine and Edward were forbidden from corresponding with each other, or if they were allowed to exchange letters, those letters would have been read by their custodians before being delivered, making it impossible to write anything truly personal or private. The separation was designed to be complete, breaking all bonds between husband and wife, except for the memories they carried in their hearts. The months at Pyrgo stretched into a year, and Catherine's situation did not improve. She and Edward both wrote letters to Queen Elizabeth begging for mercy, for forgiveness, for some relief from their imprisonment and separation. Catherine's letters were desperate and pleading, full of protestations of loyalty and expressions of remorse for having married without permission. In one such letter, Catherine begged the Queen for mercy, with upstretched hands and down-bent knees, from the bottom of my heart, acknowledging her fault and promising her complete loyalty, if only Elizabeth would show some compassion. But Catherine's letters fell on deaf ears. Queen Elizabeth was unmoved by her cousin's pleas. Whatever anger Elizabeth felt toward Catherine had hardened into an implacable hostility that no amount of begging could soften. Elizabeth had decided that Catherine would remain a prisoner for the rest of her life, separated from her husband, denied any hope of freedom or of a living as a married woman with her family. This decision was final, and nothing Catherine could say or do would change it. In November of 1564, Catherine was transferred from Pyrgo to the custody of Sir William Petre at his estate at Ingertistone Hall, also in Essex. Sir William Petre was a former Secretary of State who had served under multiple Tudor monarchs and who was experienced in government and in managing sensitive situations. He took custody of Catherine and her son Thomas, providing them with rooms in his manor house and overseeing their continued house arrest. Catherine spent 2 years in Petra's custody at Ingatestone Hall, from November 1564 to late 1566. During this time, her physical and mental health began to decline. The stress of her imprisonment, the grief over her separation from her husband and elder son, the loss of all hope for a better future, all of these factors took their toll on Catherine's body and spirit. She began to suffer from various physical ailments, and her mood darkened into depression and despair. Catherine also began to refuse food, either from a form of depression-induced anorexia that made eating unappealing, or perhaps as a deliberate form of protest against her continued captivity, or simply because she had lost all desire to continue living when life held nothing but misery. Her refusal to eat properly led to weight loss and increasing weakness. Contemporary accounts describe her as weeping constantly, refusing to care for her appearance, showing no interest in activities that had once brought her pleasure. She was, in modern terms, suffering from severe depression, a mental illness triggered by her traumatic circumstances and by the hopelessness of her situation. Sir William Petre and his household tried to care for Catherine and to encourage her to eat and to take some interest in life, but their efforts met with limited success. Catherine seemed to have given up, to have lost the will to fight for survival, or to maintain hope that things might improve. She was wasting away, both physically and emotionally, declining toward what seemed like an inevitable early death. In late 1566, Catherine was moved again, this time to the custody of Sir John Wentworth at Gosfield Hall in Essex. Wentworth was related by marriage to Sir William Petre. His first wife had been a kinswoman of Petre's, and he agreed to take responsibility for Catherine and her son. Catherine remained at Gosfield Hall for 17 months, from late 1566 through most of 1568, and during this time, her decline accelerated. She continued to refuse food, continued to weep, and to show signs of deep depression, and her physical condition deteriorated to the point where it became clear that she was dying. Throughout these years of house arrest in various locations in Essex, Catherine was completely isolated from the broader world. She received no visits from friends or family except for her custodians and their households. She was not permitted to attend court or to participate in any social activities beyond the limited confines of the manor houses where she was held. She could not travel, could not see her husband, could not visit her elder son. Her world had shrunk to the walls of whatever house held her at any given moment, and her future held nothing but more of the same endless captivity. Catherine must have thought often about her sister Jane, executed at the Tower of London in 1554, after her own brief and tragic time in the spotlight. Jane had died quickly, her suffering ending with the executioner's axe. But Catherine's suffering went on, year after year, with no end in sight except the death that she increasingly seemed to welcome as a release from her misery. In a way, Catherine's fate was even crueler than Jane's. Jane had died young, but had died quickly, while Catherine lived but only to suffer prolonged mental and physical torment. By late 1567, Katherine Grey's condition had become critical. She was emaciated from her refusal to eat properly, weak from illness, and clearly approaching death. Yet even in this state, Queen Elizabeth showed no mercy and no inclination to release Catherine from custody or to allow her to see her husband before she died. Elizabeth remained adamant that Catherine would serve out her life sentence, regardless of how short that life might now prove to be. In December of 1567 or early January of 1568, Catherine was moved one final time. She was transferred from Gosfield Hall to Cockfield Hall in Yoxford, Suffolk, under the custody of Sir Owen Hopton. This move, coming when Catherine was so seriously ill, seems almost cruel. Uprooting a dying woman from one house arrest location and moving her to another, as if there were any point to continued custody when she was so close to death. But the government apparently felt that even a dying Catherine Grey needed to be watched and controlled until the very end. Catherine arrived at Cockfield Hall in mid-January of 1568 in a state of extreme frailty. She was so weak that she could barely walk, so thin that her bones showed through her skin, so ill that everyone who saw her understood that she had only days or weeks left to live. Sir Owen Hopton and his household did what they could to make Catherine comfortable, but there was little anyone could do except wait for the inevitable end. Catherine knew she was dying. She had lived for nearly 5 years separated from her husband, 7 years as a prisoner if one counted from her initial arrest in August 1561. She had watched her younger son Thomas grow from an infant to a young child of 4 or 5 years old, but she had not seen her elder son Edward since he was a toddler of about 2 years old, and he would now be a boy of 6, with no memory of his mother. She had spent the prime of her life, from age 20 to age 27, in captivity, denied the normal pleasures and experiences of a young noblewoman, unable to live with her husband or to raise her children together as a family. As Catherine lay dying at Cockfield Hall, the women of Sir Owen Hopton's household attended her, offering what comfort they could to the young woman who had suffered so much and who was now approaching her final rest. Catherine spoke to these women about her acceptance of death, her readiness to leave a world that had brought her nothing but grief. She said to them, "No, no, my lady, my time is come, and it is not God's will that I should live any longer, and His will be done, not mine. As I am, so shall you be. Behold the picture of yourselves." These words, with their acceptance of death and their reminder that all mortal flesh must eventually perish, showed that Catherine had achieved a kind of peace in her final days, a resignation to her fate, and a faith that death would bring her the happiness that life had denied. Catherine asked that a final message be sent to Queen Elizabeth, one last attempt to reconcile with the woman who had held her captive for so long and who had shown her no mercy. She wanted Elizabeth to know, "I must needs confess I have greatly offended her, in that I made my choice without her knowledge. Otherwise, I take God to witness, I had never the heart to think any evil against Her Majesty." It was a message that acknowledged Catherine's fault in marrying without permission, while maintaining her innocence of any treasonous intent or any plot against Elizabeth. Whether this message ever reached Elizabeth, and what the Queen's reaction might have been if it did, history does not record. In her final hours, Catherine expressed to her attendants the one thing that still gave her hope. "In the world to come, I hope to live forever, for here is nothing but care and misery." These poignant words, spoken by a dying woman of 27 years old, captured the essence of Catherine's experience, a life that had promised so much but had delivered only suffering, a royal bloodline that had become a curse rather than a blessing, a love that had been punished with cruelty rather than blessed with happiness. Catherine hoped and believed with the faith of her Protestant upbringing that beyond this world of tears and imprisonment lay another world where she would be free, where she would be reunited with those she loved, where joy and peace would replace the care and misery that had defined her earthly existence. On the 26th of January, 1568, just 14 days after her arrival at Cockfield Hall, Lady Katherine Grey died. She was 27 years old, though grief and suffering had aged her beyond her years. The cause of death was officially recorded as consumption. Tuberculosis, the same disease that had killed her friend Lady Jane Seymour and that had claimed so many lives in the 16th century. But modern historians have suggested that Catherine may have died from complications of her long-term anorexia and depression, from malnutrition and the physical effects of her refusal to care for herself, from what might be described as dying of a broken heart. Whatever the specific medical cause, the ultimate responsibility for Catherine's death lay with Queen Elizabeth, who had kept her imprisoned until the end, and who had shown no mercy to her cousin. Catherine's body was prepared for burial according to the customs of the time. She would have been washed and dressed in a shroud or burial garments, her body wrapped in cerecloth or winding sheets that would help preserve it during the journey to its final resting place. Arrangements were made for Catherine to be buried at the parish church in Yoxford, near Cockfield Hall, where she had died. Queen Elizabeth, in a gesture that some might see as hypocritical, given that she had been responsible for Catherine's imprisonment and suffering, paid for the funeral expenses, ensuring that Catherine received a burial appropriate to her rank as a member of the royal family. The funeral was held at the Cockfield Chapel in Yoxford Church, and Catherine's coffin was laid to rest in this small country church, far from London and the centres of power where she had spent her youth. The burial was relatively modest, without the elaborate ceremonies that might have accompanied the funeral of a princess of the blood royal in other circumstances. There were no great nobles attending, no elaborate processions, no monuments or memorials erected to mark her passing. Katherine Grey, who had been born with royal blood and who had briefly been considered second in line to the throne, was buried in obscurity, her death noted but not, greatly mourned by a court and a government that were glad to be rid of a troublesome claimant. Catherine left behind 2 young sons who would grow to adulthood without their mother. Thomas Seymour, the younger boy, who had been Catherine's companion during her house arrest, was about 5 years old when his mother died. He was old enough to remember her, to carry memories of her love and care through his later life. Edward Seymour, Lord Beauchamp, the elder son who had been taken from his mother when he was not quite 2 years old, was now 6 years old and probably had no memories of Catherine beyond what his father and grandmother might tell him. Both boys would live quiet lives, careful to avoid any actions that might bring them under suspicion or that might be interpreted as challenging the established succession. Catherine also left behind a husband who had loved her deeply and who would mourn her loss for the rest of his long life. Edward Seymour, Earl of Hertford, was about 28 years old when Catherine died, still a relatively young man with decades of life ahead of him. He remained under various degrees of restriction and supervision for some years after Catherine's death, though the restrictions gradually loosened as Elizabeth's government became convinced that he posed no threat. Edward eventually returned to some degree of public life, though he never fully recovered his family's former prominence or the wealth that had been depleted by the massive fines imposed on him for his marriage to Catherine. Edward Seymour, Earl of Hertford, outlived his beloved Catherine by more than 50 years. He lived to the extraordinary age of 81, dying finally on the 6th of April, 1621, having witnessed the end of the Tudor dynasty and the establishment of the Stuart line under King James III. Those 53 years after Catherine's death were filled with both sorrow and resilience, as Edward tried to rebuild some semblance of a normal life while carrying the memory of his lost wife in his heart. After Catherine's death, the restrictions on Edward's freedom were gradually relaxed. Queen Elizabeth, having achieved her goal of preventing Catherine from ever threatening the succession, seemed to lose interest in punishing Edward once his wife was dead. Edward was allowed to return to some degree of public life, managing his estates, attending to his business affairs, and even occasionally appearing at court. though he never regained the favour or prominence that might have been his in different circumstances. The massive fines that had been imposed on him, £30,000 in total, cast a long shadow over his family's finances for decades. Edward married twice more after Catherine's death, and remarkably, both of these subsequent marriages were also conducted in secret, suggesting either that Edward had learned nothing from his tragic first experience or that secret marriage had simply become his peculiar habit. Neither of these later marriages brought Edward the happiness he had known with Catherine, and both ended in widowhood, as Edward outlived his second and third wives, just as he had outlived Catherine. He never forgot his first love, never stopped believing that Catherine had been his true wife, and never ceased to hope that someday their marriage would be recognized and their sons would be declared legitimate. Catherine's two sons, Edward Seymour, Lord Beauchamp, and Thomas Seymour, grew to adulthood under their father's care. Both boys were intelligent and capable, inheriting their mother's royal blood and their father's noble lineage, but both were careful to live quiet lives that would not attract unwanted attention from the government. Lord Beauchamp, the elder son, married Honora Rogers and had 6 children, ensuring that Catherine's bloodline would continue into future generations. Thomas Seymour also married, though he had no children, and he lived a respectable life before dying in 1600 at about 37 years old. The question of whether Catherine and Edward's marriage had been valid continued to be debated long after Catherine's death. When Queen Elizabeth died in March of 1603, the succession passed to King James II of Scotland, who became King James I of England. James was descended from Henry VIII's elder sister Margaret, rather than from his younger sister Mary, and under strict rules of hereditary succession, James probably had the stronger claim. But under Henry VIII's will, which had given the succession to the descendants of Mary rather than Margaret, Catherine's sons could argue that they had a better right to the throne than James did. Shortly after becoming king, James received a petition from Edward Seymour, now an elderly man of about 64 years old, asking that his marriage to Catherine be recognized as valid and that his sons be declared legitimate. This petition must have cost Edward considerable emotional effort. He was asking the new king to admit that James's own claim to the throne might be questionable, that Catherine and Edward's sons might have a better right to rule England than James himself. It was a bold request, and it showed that even in old age, Edward had not given up on seeking justice for Catherine's memory and legitimacy for their children. Initially, King James seemed inclined to consider the petition favourably. An investigation was launched, testimonies were heard, and it appeared that a verdict recognising the marriage's validity might be delivered. But then James had second thoughts, apparently realising that such a verdict might undermine his own position or create complications for the succession. The Attorney General, Sir Edward Coke, intervened to halt the proceedings before any formal verdict could be announced. The jury had apparently been on the point of finding in favour of the marriage, but that verdict was never formally delivered, leaving the question unresolved. It was not until the reign of King Charles I, James's son, that the Stuart dynasty finally felt secure enough to acknowledge the validity of Catherine and Edward's marriage. In 1626, William Seymour, Catherine's grandson through her elder son, Lord Beauchamp, was allowed to take his place in the House of Lords as the rightful heir to the Hertford title. This represented a tacit acknowledgement that Catherine and Edward had indeed been married, and that their sons had been legitimate. It was a vindication that came far too late to help Catherine herself, but it must have brought some satisfaction to her elderly husband Edward and to her surviving descendants, who had lived under the cloud of illegitimacy for so long. When Edward Seymour died in April of 1621, he was laid to rest at Salisbury Cathedral, one of England's great medieval churches. Salisbury Cathedral, with its soaring spire and its magnificent Gothic architecture, had been a place of worship for centuries, and it served as the final resting place for many important families from the surrounding region. Edward's tomb at Salisbury was a fitting memorial for a man who had endured so much suffering and who had lived so long after losing the woman he loved. But Catherine remained buried at the small parish church in Yoxford, Suffolk, far from her husband and from the centres of power where she had lived her youth. For more than 50 years after her death, Catherine's grave at Yoxford marked the place where her earthly remains rested, separated in death from the husband she had been separated from in life. This geographical separation seemed to perpetuate even beyond the grave the cruel punishment that Queen Elizabeth had imposed, keeping Catherine and Edward apart even after death had released them from earthly suffering. In the 1640s, during the tumultuous years of the English Civil War, Catherine's grandson William Seymour, who had by this time become the second Duke of Somerset, after the Hertford title was elevated, decided to rectify this final injustice. William arranged for Catherine's remains to be exhumed from their resting place at Yoxford Church and transported to Salisbury Cathedral, where they could be buried alongside her husband Edward in a tomb that would commemorate their love and their eventual reunion. The reburial at Salisbury Cathedral was more than just a practical matter of moving a coffin from one location to another. It was a symbolic act of healing and reconciliation, an acknowledgement that Catherine and Edward had truly been husband and wife despite all the official denials, and a recognition that love had ultimately triumphed over the forces that had tried to destroy it. Catherine's body was brought to Salisbury and interred beside Edward's in a magnificent tomb that still stands today in the cathedral. The tomb itself is a work of art and a testament to enduring love. It features carved stone effigies of Catherine and Edward lying side by side, their hands nearly touching across the small gap that separates them. The effigies show them as they might have looked in life, young, beautiful, peaceful in death. They are dressed in the noble clothing of their era, with every detail of fabric and jewelry carefully rendered in stone. The tomb's inscription commemorates their lives and their love, ensuring that future generations would know their story and would remember them not as criminals or fornicators, but as a married couple who loved each other. The tomb at Salisbury Cathedral became a monument to a love that survived royal persecution, that endured through years of separation and suffering, and that ultimately could not be destroyed by any earthly power. Catherine and Edward, who had been forcibly kept apart for the last 7 years of Catherine's life, who had been forbidden from seeing each other or living together as husband and wife, were finally reunited in death. The small gap between their stone effigies represents all the pain and loss they endured, but it also shows that even that gap could not ultimately keep them apart. Their hands reached toward each other across that gap, symbolizing the love that connected them even when they were separated, and promising that in the world beyond death, there were no more barriers between them. Katherine Grey's story has resonated through the centuries as a tale of tragic romance, political persecution, and the terrible price that could be paid for following one's heart in defiance of royal authority. Her life reminds us of the challenges faced by women of royal blood in the Tudor era, women who were seen as valuable political assets rather than as individuals with their own desires and rights. Catherine wanted what any young woman might want: to marry the man she loved, to have children with him, to build a life together. But her royal blood made such simple wishes impossible, transforming love into treason and marriage into a crime. The treatment Catherine received from Queen Elizabeth remains one of the darker aspects of Elizabeth's otherwise celebrated reign. Elizabeth is rightly remembered as one of England's greatest monarchs, a woman who guided her nation through religious conflict and foreign threats to an era of cultural flowering and national pride. But Elizabeth's treatment of Katherine Grey shows the ruthless side of her character, the willingness to destroy even a young woman guilty only of falling in love, the refusal to show mercy even when mercy would have cost nothing. Elizabeth kept Catherine imprisoned until death, separated her from her husband and children, and ensured that Catherine's brief life was filled with suffering far out of proportion to any offence she had committed. Yet Catherine's story is ultimately one of love's triumph, rather than love's defeat. Despite everything that Elizabeth did to punish and to separate, Catherine and Edward's love survived. They remained devoted to each other through years of separation. They never stopped believing that they were truly married, and their descendants eventually won recognition of their marriage's validity. The tomb at Salisbury Cathedral stands as proof that love can endure beyond death, that persecution cannot destroy genuine feeling, and that even those who seem powerless can ultimately achieve a form of victory through their steadfastness and devotion. Catherine's two sons lived quiet lives, but continued their mother's bloodline, ensuring that her descendants would play roles in English history for generations to come. Her grandson, William Seymour, married Lady Arabella Stuart, another claimant to the throne, in a secret marriage that eerily echoed his grandmother's story, showing that the pattern of forbidden royal romances continued into the next generation. The recognition of Catherine's marriage in 1626 meant that her descendants could hold their heads high, knowing that their grandmother had been a lawfully wedded wife and not a criminal guilty of fornication. Today, visitors to Salisbury Cathedral can stand before the tomb of Katherine Grey and Edward Seymour and see them as they wish to be remembered, reunited in death, lying peacefully side by side, their love commemorated in stone for eternity. The tomb has become a place of pilgrimage for those interested in Tudor history and for those who are moved by stories of love triumphing over adversity. People who visit the tomb often pause to reflect on Catherine's suffering and on the enduring power of the love she shared with Edward. Catherine's story reminds us that even in the darkest times, even under the most oppressive circumstances, human beings can find love and meaning. Catherine lived most of her adult life as a prisoner, denied freedom, and denied the chance to be with those she loved most. Yet she found purpose in caring for her son, Thomas, during her house arrest. She maintained her dignity even in the face of humiliation and persecution, and she never stopped loving Edward despite the years of forced separation. Her final words, "In the world to come I hope to live forever, for here is nothing but care and misery," expressed both her suffering and her faith that something better awaited beyond this life. As you drift off to sleep tonight, dear listener, let yourself imagine Catherine and Edward finally at peace, reunited in the tomb at Salisbury Cathedral, their stone effigies lying side by side in the quiet beauty of that ancient church. Imagine them beyond suffering now, beyond the reach of jealous queens and political machinations, beyond imprisonment and separation, together at last in a place where love needs no permission and where royal blood brings blessing rather than curse. Let Catherine's story remind you that love is worth fighting for, that dignity can be maintained even in the face of injustice, and that faith in something better beyond our immediate suffering can sustain us through the darkest times. Let her courage inspire you. Let her suffering move you to compassion for all who endure hardship, and let her ultimate reunion with Edward in death give you hope that love truly does conquer all in the end. Sleep now, gentle dreamer, with thoughts of Catherine and Edward, watching over your rest from their peaceful tomb in Salisbury. May you find in sleep the same peace that they have found in death, a peace beyond suffering, beyond separation, beyond all the cares and miseries of this world. May your dreams be gentle, your rest be deep, and your awakening be refreshed and renewed. And may you remember, as you go about your days, that even the briefest life can leave a legacy of love, that even those who suffer unjustly are not forgotten, and that somewhere beyond our sight there is a place where Katherine Grey is free at last, reunited with those she loved, living forever in the happiness that was denied her on earth. Good night, dear listener. Thank you for joining me on this journey through Katherine Grey's tragic and beautiful story. Until we meet again for another peaceful exploration of history's quiet tales, sleep well, dream sweetly, and may gentle Catherine watch over your rest.